Hi, welcome friends. You're watching The Last Hike. Today I'll be going over hiking deaths so ridiculous that they definitely deserve Darwin Awards. From a man who hired the best guides he could find and then decided to cross the most dangerous section of the route alone during a record-breaking heat wave to one 15-second TikTok that convinced a woman she could conquer one of the deadliest day hikes in the country.
It was June 28, 2018, Panamint Valley, California. A flat open basin of gravel and salt flats pressed between two mountain ranges, sitting at roughly 1,100 feet above sea level with no shade anywhere on the floor and no water anywhere on the surface. A heat warning had been in effect for the region since June 26th. Furnace Creek, 20 miles to the northeast, had already hit 122 degrees the day before. It was going to get worse. Jeevan Driscoll was 46 years old. He grew up in Odessa and went straight into the oil fields after high school. Over the next 2 decades, he worked his way up from roughneck to crew supervisor and eventually built his own independent contracting outfit operating across the Permian Basin. By 2018, the business had reached a solid mid-sized scale. He was servicing active drill sites across West Texas, managing crews, bidding contracts, and keeping equipment running in conditions most people would consider genuinely brutal. And the conditions really were brutal. Summers in the Permian Basin run hot from May through September. 12-hour shifts on open drill pads in temperatures that regularly hit 105 or 108 degrees, all while wearing flame-resistant clothing that trapped heat against the body. There were hourly breaks, cooling trailers on the better run sites, and constant hydration protocols. Heat stress was a known part of the job. Heavy sweating, nausea, dizziness, and Driscoll had spent nearly 20 years working through it himself and helping crews do the same. He wasn't a man who spent his days in an air-conditioned office. He was physically fit, a non-smoker, and usually ran a few miles in the mornings when he was between contracts. To him, suffering through heat wasn't some abstract thing that people wrote books about. It was part of the job. The Death Valley crossing had been on his mind for about 8 months. He talked about it to people around him as a personal benchmark. Something physical, something most people couldn't do, something that had nothing to do with work, money, or managing other people. Just him and the terrain. He took the planning seriously. He read first-hand accounts, studied routes, and spent time understanding what a crossing like that actually involved. Once he felt he had a handle on it, he went looking for the best guide he could find, and he found one. The guide he hired had spent more than 15 years running private backcountry trips in Death Valley. He was fully authorized to operate there and had the experience to back it up. He'd completed versions of the same corridor crossing before, always during the cooler months and always with clients who stuck to the schedule. The fee came to $80,000. That covered custom gear, pre-cached supply waypoints at 3 locations along the route, satellite communication equipment, and a fully mapped corridor from the Panamint Valley floor eastward to stovepipe wells over 3 days. Driscoll paid without negotiating. The way he saw it, writing the check wasn't the hard part. The hard part was still waiting for him out in the desert. The pre-trip briefing happened 2 weeks before departure. The guide walked Driscoll through the route in detail, daily distances, waypoint locations, the water allocation schedule, the movement windows, the midday halt protocol. He explained the reasoning behind every element. He was direct about the forecast window they were entering. Late June in Death Valley is not a gray area. It is the most dangerous time of year in one of the most dangerous places in the country, and the guide said exactly that. Driscoll's response, according to the guide's later account, was measured. He asked good questions. He engaged with the logistics. But he kept returning to the schedule, specifically to the midday halt windows. He said he'd worked through worse. The guide told him that what he'd worked through and what they were walking into were not the same thing. It's a surprisingly common mistake. Experience with one kind of hardship can make people assume that they're prepared for a completely different one. The Panamint Valley floor sits at roughly 1,100 feet above sea level, caught between 2 mountain ranges that trap and compress hot air against the ground around the clock. The basin absorbs solar radiation all day and releases it slowly through the night. In late June 2018, overnight lows in the region were holding between 88 and 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Think about what that means for a moment. The coolest it got at any point during the night was nearly 90 degrees. There was no recovery window. The body never got a chance to reset. Every morning, Driscoll woke up already behind. The human body's core temperature sits at around 98.6 degrees. It starts struggling above 102. Heat exhaustion, heavy sweating, weakness, nausea, rapid pulse typically appears between 101 and 104 degrees. Heat stroke, where the body's cooling system begins to fail, starts above 104. Once that line is crossed, things can unravel quickly. Confusion comes first, then disorientation. Then the loss of coordination. Eventually, the body stops being able to do basic things it normally takes for granted. What most people don't realize is that the brain starts slipping long before that point. Even mild dehydration can impair attention, concentration, and short-term memory. Navigation becomes less reliable. Decisions take longer. The brain starts missing things it would normally catch. And in Death Valley, during a record heat event, that decline doesn't announce itself. It happens quietly while you're still convinced you're fine. A man who has worked in 108-degree heat in West Texas has no physiological advantage in 129-degree air over a valley floor, radiating over 160 degrees at his feet. The body does not build tolerance to temperatures that exceed its ability to cool itself. It just fails faster or slower depending on hydration, exertion level, and how long the exposure lasts. Driscoll had spent 20 years believing he was heat-hardened. He wasn't wrong about West Texas. He was completely wrong about Death Valley. What made Driscoll vulnerable wasn't a lack of competence. In some ways, it was the confidence that competence had earned him. The guide's plan was built around one non-negotiable rule: no movement between 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. The morning window ran from 3:30 to 8:30. 5 hours of movement in pre-dawn and early morning conditions before the valley floor became untenable. He carried 2 portable shade shelters specifically designed for midday halts in exposed terrain. Water was allocated at 1 liter per hour of movement, the minimum for extreme heat conditions, with mandatory electrolyte intake at every rest stop. 3 pre-cached waypoints along the route held additional supply. Every single element of that plan existed because the guide had spent 15 years watching what this place does when people improvise. One thing that always surprises me about wilderness travel is how much of it comes down to restraint. Knowing when not to move can matter more than knowing how. Day 1, June 28, 2018. The high at Furnace Creek, roughly 20 miles to the northeast, was 122 degrees. They started at 3:30 in the morning. The valley floor before dawn has a strange, disorienting quality to it. Death Valley has some of the darkest skies in the country, almost no artificial light nearby, and out on the flat open basin, the ground and horizon seem to blend together. You navigate by the dark outlines of the mountain ranges on either side, and by whatever instruments you're carrying. The guide relied on a compass and a GPS unit. Even at 3:30 a.m., the air was already 89 degrees. Not cool, not comfortable. Just less dangerous than it would be a few hours later. They covered roughly 9 miles before stopping for the midday halt and reached the first waypoint in good condition. Driscoll moved well. There was never much question about his physical capability. But throughout the morning, he kept comparing the heat to job sites in Midland and Odessa. He called the pace conservative. At one point during the midday rest, he asked whether they could keep moving through the afternoon window instead of waiting. The guide explained the reasoning again. Cumulative dehydration, ground radiation, the difference between air temperature and the radiant heat coming off the valley floor, where the ground was pushing well over 150 degrees into their legs. Driscoll listened. He didn't press the issue any further that day. But the guide made a note of it. That night, the temperature didn't drop below 90 degrees. Driscoll slept, but not deeply. The heat doesn't let you. You lie still, and your body keeps working, keeps trying to regulate, keeps spending resources it needs for the next day. By the time the alarm went off, he had already been in the heat for hours without moving. Day 2, June 29, 2018. High of 128 degrees at Furnace Creek. The guide moved the morning start to 3 a.m. to account for the climbing forecast. Driscoll was up and ready, which the guide noted positively. They moved in the pre-dawn dark across the gravel floor, headlamps cutting a narrow path through terrain that was flat but uneven loose rock, shallow wash channels, scattered low scrub that was hard to see until you were on top of it. The Panamint Range was visible to the east as a broad black mass against the slightly lighter sky. That's your landmark on the valley floor at night. A silhouette, not a precise bearing, a general direction. During the morning movement window, Driscoll started making small adjustments of his own. He skipped one of the scheduled water stops, saying he wasn't thirsty. On 2 separate stretches, he drifted slightly ahead of the pace the guide had set, not by much, maybe 30 or 40 feet, but enough for it to become noticeable. At one point, he reconfigured his pack without mentioning it. None of those things were dangerous on their own, but the guide had been doing this long enough to recognize the pattern. It usually meant a client had started believing, somewhere in the back of their mind, that they understood the situation better than the plan did. By the end of the morning window on day 2, the guide noticed a few early signs that the heat was starting to accumulate. Driscoll's resting heart rate was a little higher than it had been the day before. He had less appetite. He was slower to rehydrate during the midday halt. None of it would have been alarming by itself. With the forecast for the following day, it was enough to get the guide's attention. During the midday break, he brought up the skipped water stop directly. He reminded Driscoll that thirst isn't a reliable signal in extreme heat. By the time you actually feel thirsty, you're often already running a meaningful deficit. Driscoll said he understood. Then he asked how far behind schedule they would be if they took the entire midday halt. The question itself wasn't unreasonable. It was the fact that he was still thinking about time after everything else they'd discussed. That evening, June 29th, the guide sat down with Driscoll and walked him through the next day's forecast in detail. June 30th was expected to be the peak of the heat event. Furnace Creek was forecast to reach 129 degrees Fahrenheit. The next section of the route was a 6-mile crossing of completely open valley floor, the most exposed stretch of the entire trip. There was no natural shade, no practical bailout option once they were committed, and no meaningful landmarks at ground level to navigate by. The guide suggested they hold position for 24 hours and let the worst of the heat pass. He explained his reasoning clearly and didn't soften the risk. Driscoll refused. He said they were on schedule and intended to stay on schedule. He said he'd been through worse. The trouble with experience is that it gives us something to compare everything else against. Sometimes the comparison fits, sometimes it doesn't. The guy documented the conversation in his log. He wrote down the time. He noted that the client had been informed of the forecast and the associated risks in explicit terms and had declined to alter the plan. That night, the temperature hovered around 92 degrees. By then, Driscoll's body had spent 2 straight nights in heat that never dropped below 90. His fluid balance, electrolyte levels, and ability to regulate core temperature were all operating at a deficit before June 30th had even begun. He didn't know that. What he felt was tired, the kind of tired that follows a couple of hard days of physical work. It was a familiar feeling. He dealt with it before. He knew how to push through tired. At 4:22 a.m. on June 30th, the guide got up to begin the morning preparations and noticed that Driscoll's sleeping spot was empty. His pack was gone. Of the 4 1-liter water containers staged at the waypoint for the next leg, the guide's calculated minimum for a 6-mile crossing under the forecast conditions, 2 were missing. The other 2 were still sitting there. His satellite phone had been left on the ground next to his sleeping mat, powered off. His GPS watch, however, was still on his wrist. He had left on his own. He had left in the dark, carrying half the water the guide had planned for the crossing. He had no navigation equipment and no way to call for help, and he was heading east across 6 miles of open valley floor on what was expected to be the hottest day of the year. The guide radioed for assistance at 4:35 a.m. and immediately started moving east. Records later showed that Driscoll had left camp at 3:48 a.m. The air temperature in the Panamint Valley at that hour was approximately 91 degrees, already warm, already pulling moisture from the body with every breath. Under his boots, the valley floor was a mix of hard-packed gravel and stretches of pale salt crust, still releasing heat stored during 2 consecutive days of record temperatures. His pace held at roughly 3 miles per hour. It was steady and purposeful. The GPS track showed him moving straight east, closely aligned with the intended route. In the pre-dawn darkness, the Panamint Range appeared as a black silhouette on the horizon, a useful reference point, but not a precise bearing. Without a compass or a GPS unit of his own, Driscoll was navigating by instinct and the outline of the mountains, much the way he might have found his way around a dark job site back in Texas. Up to that point in his life, that approach had always worked. Driscoll probably felt like he was making up time. In reality, he was trading water, energy, and body temperature for every mile. At approximately 4:28 a.m., the GPS track began to drift, about 8 degrees south of the intended bearing. It was a gradual shift, the kind that would have been almost impossible to notice in the dark. On flat, featureless terrain, being 8 degrees off course doesn't feel like anything. The ground looks the same no matter which direction you're facing. The mountains are still roughly where you expect them to be. As far as you can tell, you're heading exactly where you're supposed to go. So he kept moving. By 5:15 a.m., he was 2.1 miles from camp and already 0.4 of a mile south of the intended route. The sun was starting to come up. The air temperature had climbed to 108 degrees. His pace was still close to 3 miles per hour. The GPS track shows no stops during this period. He kept moving steadily, with no hesitation and no indication that he thought anything was wrong. This was the point where something should have tipped him off, but apparently nothing did. The sun was rising in the east, directly ahead of him on the intended bearing. A man with 20 years of outdoor work behind him would normally use something like that as a rough check on direction. Yet the drift continued even as the light improved. Maybe the terrain gave him no reason to question where he was going. Maybe the effects of heat and dehydration were already beginning to narrow his focus. Most likely, it was some combination of the two. Being lost and realizing you're lost are two very different things. Driscoll had already done the first without yet reaching the second. Meanwhile, something else was happening inside his body, whether he noticed it or not. After 2.5 miles of exertion in 108-degree heat, carrying a pack on a body that had already spent 2 nights in near 90-degree temperatures without fully recovering, his fluid deficit was growing. Under those conditions, sweat loss can reach roughly 1 to 1.2 liters per hour. He had started with 2 liters. The numbers were already moving in the wrong direction. His pace dropped to around 1.8 miles per hour. The sun was fully up now, and the air temperature was climbing past 112 degrees. Underfoot, the valley floor had shifted from hard gravel to stretches of pale salt crust that reflected sunlight and pushed heat back upward with every step. Surface temperatures were approaching 150 degrees. By then, he was more than 0.8 of a mile south of the intended route and drifting farther away with each step. The mountain silhouettes that had helped orient him in the dark no longer offered much guidance. From the middle of the valley floor, they looked much the same from almost any position. There was nothing obvious to correct against. No road, no building, no tree, nothing. By this point, his 2 liters of water were almost certainly gone. He had been moving for roughly 90 minutes in steadily rising heat, carrying a body that was already starting from a fluid deficit built up over the previous 2 days. The sweating that had been keeping him cool was becoming less effective as his reserves dropped. His heart was working harder to move thickening blood through vessels that were beginning to narrow. His core temperature was rising. He was sweating heavily. His heart rate was elevated. His legs were beginning to feel the particular kind of heaviness that comes with heat exhaustion, not ordinary muscle fatigue, but something deeper, something that doesn't simply go away because you decide to push harder. He had felt versions of it before on job sites. In West Texas, you find some shade, drink water, sit down for 20 minutes, and eventually it passes. Out here, there was no shade. The water was gone, and the temperature was still climbing. His pace dropped below 1 mile per hour. The GPS data shows 2 full stops, each lasting somewhere between 4 and 6 minutes. That's consistent with someone sitting down to rest. By then, he was 1.2 miles south of the route. The air temperature had reached 118 degrees. Surface temperatures on the salt crust were above 160. He had no water left. It's worth pausing on what that number actually means. 160 degrees wasn't the air temperature, it was the surface he was sitting on during those stops. The salt crust beneath him was radiating heat upward into his body while the air pressed down from above. There was nowhere to move that wasn't hot. Those stops are significant for another reason. One of the early neurological effects of heat stroke is impaired judgment, particularly the inability to accurately assess your own condition. People in the early stages often believe they just need a few minutes of rest and will feel better afterward. They sit down expecting to get back up and continue. Sometimes they do. Sometimes the body has already crossed a threshold they can't recognize. Driscoll sat down. Then he got back up and continued walking in the same wrong direction. The GPS track shows a final stretch of less than 1/3 of a mile at a pace below 0.5 mile per hour. By this point, the track was no longer straight. It drifted slightly south, then corrected slightly north, then wandered south again. That kind of irregular movement is consistent with ataxia, the loss of coordinated muscle control that often accompanies severe heat stroke. The brain is no longer sending clean signals to the muscles. The body is still capable of moving, but it is no longer navigating with any real precision. It is simply continuing forward. At 7:02 a.m., the GPS watch recorded its final position. The last location was 1.4 miles south-southwest of the intended route, out on the open floor of Panamint Valley. The terrain was a mix of salt crust and gravel. There was no shade visible in any direction. An empty water container lay beside him. At that hour, the air temperature at Furnace Creek was already 118 degrees and still climbing toward the day's projected high of 129. Surface temperatures where he stopped were estimated to be above 160 degrees. The GPS data doesn't show a collapse or any sudden event. Instead, it shows a pace that had been steadily declining for nearly 2 hours, finally reaching 0 and never increasing again. The guide's radio call at 4:35 a.m. had already set a search effort in motion, but the size of the terrain and the rapidly increasing heat created immediate challenges. By 8 a.m., conditions on the open valley floor were becoming dangerous even for search personnel. An aerial search was organized. A helicopter located Driscoll at 9:47 a.m., 5 hours and 9 minutes after he had left camp. He was found face down on the valley floor, 1.4 miles from the intended route. He was unresponsive. Ground crews reached him shortly afterward, and he was transported immediately. He was pronounced dead. His time of death was estimated to have occurred between 7 and 8 a.m., consistent with the data recorded by the GPS watch. Jivan Driscoll was 46 years old. He was found on the floor of Panamint Valley on the morning of June 30th, 2018, the same day Furnace Creek recorded 129 degrees Fahrenheit, the hottest June temperature ever reliably measured on Earth. He had been moving alone across exposed terrain for approximately 3 hours and 15 minutes. He had no shade, no communication device, no navigation equipment, and only half the water the crossing called for. He was found 1.4 miles from where he was supposed to be. The post-mortem examination determined the cause of death to be hyperthermia, exertional heat stroke complicated by acute dehydration. The autopsy findings themselves were largely unremarkable. There was mild cerebral edema and clear evidence of significant dehydration, but no pre-existing cardiac disease, vascular disease, or other underlying condition that contributed to his death. By all available evidence, he had been physically healthy. The death was ruled accidental. The official findings cited several contributing factors: separating from the guided group before the designated movement window, carrying an inadequate water supply for the forecast conditions, traveling without personal navigation equipment, leaving the satellite communication device behind and powered off, and sustained exertion on exposed terrain during a record heat event. The guide was cleared of any negligence. His permits, radio logs, and field notes documented the warnings he gave, the risks he explained, and the decisions Driscoll made on his own during the final 48 hours of the trip. The evidence that closed the case was remarkably consistent. The GPS watch provided position points at roughly 1-minute intervals, creating a record of his route from departure to the point where he stopped moving. The satellite phone's final sync, recorded the previous evening, confirmed his position at the waypoint. The guide's radio logs established the timeline of the search and response. 2 unused water containers remained at camp. 1 empty container was recovered at the scene. Partial boot prints preserved in softer sections of the salt crust matched the direction and distance of his deviation from the intended route. Every piece of evidence pointed toward the same conclusion. Driscoll hadn't died because he was weak, reckless, or unprepared. He died because, for the very first time in a very long time, the experience he trusted wasn't enough for the place he was in. It was July 10th, 2015. Surprise Canyon in Death Valley National Park was a narrow, rock-walled drainage where confined terrain and extreme heat quickly intensified conditions. Sunlight reflected off canyon walls, limiting shade to brief, shifting pockets. Jackson Dubois, 38, was a Colorado-based outdoor content creator running a gear testing channel focused on field performance under extreme conditions. His collaborator, Nadia Mbeki, 35, was a photographer assisting with documentation, with limited formal wilderness experience but strong general fitness. The expedition was structured as a sponsored product evaluation of heat-adaptive outdoor equipment, with deliverables tied to documented real-world performance and field footage expected for post-production review. Prior to the trip, Jackson tested a cooling vest, hydration system, solar charger, and lightweight footwear under controlled conditions with limited environmental stress, reinforcing confidence in their reliability. However, those tests did not replicate sustained exposure in a confined desert canyon, where radiant heat from rock surfaces, ground temperatures exceeding 150 degrees Fahrenheit in exposed sections, and restricted airflow sharply increased physiological strain over time. My impression here is that the testing setup and the actual environment just feel like 2 completely different worlds. The pair entered Surprise Canyon early in the morning with a 2-day water supply intended for moderate exertion and planned filming stops. Initial progress was steady with intermittent shade, but rising sun quickly intensified heat as canyon walls began reflecting radiation into the narrow corridor, creating sustained exposure even in partially shaded sections. By mid-morning, the cooling vests start to lose effectiveness. The phase change material inside them is basically spent, so at that point it's just a slight surface cooling effect, nothing that actually helps with the core body heat anymore. They're sweating heavily too, both of them, and that's speeding up dehydration fast. On top of that, the terrain keeps forcing constant effort, uneven ground, short climbs, all within the canyon floor, so there's really no chance to settle or recover. A solar charger they set up around midday also doesn't hold up well. The extreme heat causes it to overheat and shut down intermittently. So instead of steady power, it only gives short, unreliable bursts of charging. By early afternoon, they reach a planned rest point. Water is already running low, and early signs of dehydration are showing headache, fatigue, slower thinking. But at the time, it still just feels like normal exertion, not something that calls for turning back. It reads to me like things are starting to feel routine even while they aren't. They decide to push on to an upper canyon section for more documentation anyway, staying out through the peak heat window when the sun's radiation is at its strongest. On the way back, things start to fall apart faster. The heat stress and dehydration don't level off, they stack. Then one more issue hits. Jaxian's footwear starts breaking down. The adhesive softens in the heat and the sole begins to separate, which makes movement unstable. Every step takes more effort, slower, and more careful, right when fluid levels are already critically low. Shortly afterward, both individuals exhausted their remaining water supplies. Nadia developed acute gastrointestinal distress alongside worsening heat illness, forcing repeated stops in minimal available shade. Cognitive function declined in both individuals, with impaired decision-making, reduced situational awareness, and slowed response to environmental cues. Communication systems initially failed due to lack of signal within the canyon and device limitations under thermal stress. As conditions deteriorated, Nadia managed to reach a higher ridgeline and briefly establish emergency contact, transmitting location data and initiating a rescue response before her condition worsened further. Me seeing her having to climb just to get signal really highlights how a location alone can control whether help is even possible. While awaiting rescue, Jaxian's condition rapidly progressed from heat exhaustion to severe heat stroke. He became disoriented, unable to maintain coherent speech, and lost the ability to regulate body temperature. Core physiological collapse followed sustained hyperthermia and dehydration. Rescue teams arrived after several hours via coordinated ground and aerial deployment. Nadia was located first in critical condition and evacuated, while Jaxian was found shortly after in a lower drainage segment, unresponsive, with signs consistent with advanced heat stroke. Despite rapid cooling efforts and emergency transport, both individuals' conditions had progressed beyond recovery. Jaxian was pronounced dead shortly after evacuation due to hyperthermia and multi-organ failure from prolonged exposure, exertion, and dehydration. Nadia also succumbed to severe heat stroke and organ failure during emergency treatment at a medical facility. In the aftermath, investigators identified multiple contributing factors, including reliance on controlled condition equipment testing, underestimation of radiant heat amplification within confined canyon geometry, continued exertion during early physiological decline, and delayed emergency activation due to communication constraints. The incident was later cited in outdoor safety analyses as a case demonstrating how gear performance claims and controlled testing environments cannot substitute for real-world thermal load assessment in extreme desert terrain. It was July 14, 2015. The Bright Angel Trail at Grand Canyon National Park dropped nearly 5,000 feet from the south rim to the canyon floor. The walls on either side trapped heat like an oven, radiating it back at ground level long after the sun had already done its work. By 9 in the morning, the trailhead was sitting at 91 degrees Fahrenheit. By noon, the inner canyon would hit 113. Laura Gale Thurston was 44 years old and worked as a project manager in a suburb outside Columbus, Ohio. She was a confident person who trusted her own judgment and wasn't particularly inclined to second-guess herself. For months, she had been planning a trip to the Grand Canyon and felt she had done everything necessary to prepare. She went to the gym twice a week, took long walks every Sunday, and spent weeks breaking in a new pair of trail shoes around her neighborhood. By the time she arrived, she was convinced she was ready. She made the trip alone. Looking at her, it's easy to see why she felt prepared. The problem was that she never realized that there was a difference between being prepared for a hike and being prepared for this hike. She filled a single 16-ounce water bottle at the trailhead and started her descent at 8:50 in the morning. Right there at the kiosk, a sign read, "Carry at least 1 liter of water per hour." "Do not hike to the river and back in one day." She stopped, read it, took a photo of it, and kept walking. Not in a rush, just decided it did not apply to her. At the rest stop, a water station was clearly marked and free to use. A couple resting there pointed it out to her. She told them she was fine, not really thirsty yet, and kept moving. She finished her water somewhere along the next stretch of trail. By the time she reached the rest stop at about a mile and a half down, she had been hiking for nearly 2 hours in rising heat with nothing left to drink. A volunteer trail ambassador offered to refill her bottle. Laura let him fill it halfway before stopping him, saying she wasn't planning to stay out much longer. When he warned her about the heat farther down the trail, she brushed it off as a simple day hike. After a short rest, she continued deeper into the canyon. Then she stood up and kept going down. Past the rest house, the trail drops into the inner canyon, where the walls close in and the heat has nowhere to escape. There were no more water stations beyond that point, no shade to speak of, and no staffed posts. The temperature in that section of the canyon was around 109 degrees and still climbing. By then, she had been without water for close to 90 minutes. A pair of hikers heading up the trail passed her near the 2.5-mile marker below the rest house. They noticed that she was moving slowly and stopping every few minutes to press her hand flat against the canyon wall. Something about the way she looked caught their attention. Despite the extreme heat, her skin appeared unusually dry. One of the hikers asked if she was okay, but she waved him off without looking up and continued on her way.
That's not just stubbornness, that's someone who genuinely believed that she had it under control when every single thing around her was saying complete otherwise.
When your body stops sweating in that kind of heat, it does not mean you have adjusted. It means your cooling system has shut down and your core temperature is already climbing past the point of no return. Laura almost certainly did not know that, but that is exactly what was happening while she was still walking. About 20 minutes later, a group of 4 hikers heading down the trail found her sitting against the canyon wall with her legs out and her head tilted back. She was conscious, but unable to respond. Her breathing was rapid, and her skin was hot and completely dry. One hiker stayed with her while another checked her bag. Inside were sunscreen, a paper map, a phone with a dead battery, and an empty water bottle. There was no food or electrolyte replacement. With no signal available, one member of the group headed back toward the rest house for help. Laura lost consciousness before he returned. The report reached emergency services through a radio relay at around 1:45 that afternoon. A helicopter was dispatched, but strong winds delayed the approach. Ground rescuers arrived roughly 80 minutes after the first call and found no pulse. Resuscitation efforts continued during the airlift, but she was pronounced dead at a regional medical facility. Laura's body was recovered 2.5 miles below the rest stop near the 3-mile mark. The coroner determined the cause of death was hypovolemic shock from severe dehydration, with hyperthermia as a contributing factor. Her core temperature at rescue was 106.8 degrees Fahrenheit. The trail ambassador's log documented his warning about conditions farther down the trail and her decision to continue with only a partially filled bottle. Witness statements from the couple at the earlier rest stop and the group of 4 supported the timeline. The case was ruled accidental. A 16-ounce bottle and a photo of a warning sign was apparently all the preparation Laura thought she needed. Not far away, a woman who grew up in the desert convinced herself that was enough of an advantage to hike to the Colorado River and back in a single day. It was April 14th, 2023. A remote section of Death Valley National Park formed a network of canyons, dry washes, and broken ridgelines where navigation errors could quickly lead to isolation. The terrain included narrow limestone cuts, unstable talus slopes, and dry drainages with seasonal or unreliable water sources. Jonah Okoye, 34, was a Texas-based content creator running a channel testing new tech in real-world settings. He was especially focused on AI tools, basically seeing if they could actually handle planning trips, not just generate them on paper. For this project, he used an AI travel assistant to build a full wilderness route with almost no input from him.
I keep noticing how easy it's become to treat AI output like it's already been checked for facts, even when it hasn't.
A few days before the trip, he accepts an AI-generated Death Valley route with canyons, a mapped water source, and a ridge connection, treating it as a controlled test without really adjusting or questioning it. The plan looked structured but had major issues that weren't caught before departure. A seasonally dry water source, altered routes from erosion and flash flooding, underestimated hydration needs, and a ridge section requiring technical talus movement. None of it was independently verified. A park ranger briefly warned him that water in the area was uncertain, but he proceeded anyway. He entered the backcountry with limited water, standard gear, and no emergency communication device. Once past the trailhead, cell service dropped as he moved deeper into the canyon system under rising temperatures.
I've seen that moment before where the connection just disappears and you're fully on your own after that point.
Early progress through the drainage network was steady, though an unexpected washout forced an unplanned detour across unstable debris fields. The added distance and physical effort increased exertion beyond initial projections. By late morning, as ambient temperatures climbed and solar exposure intensified, his rate of hydration consumption increased significantly. As the terrain opened into exposed sections of sand and fractured rock, heat reflected upward from pale surfaces, compounding thermal strain. Fatigue began to accumulate, and rest intervals became more frequent. Despite these signs, Jonah continued along the planned route, relying on the assumption that the next waypoint would provide relief and replenishment. At the mapped water source, Jonah found only a dry basin, as the AI had incorrectly assumed seasonal flow. With no nearby alternatives and reduced reserves, he documented the failure on camera but continued the route, prioritizing completion of the experiment over retreat. Overnight conditions allowed limited recovery, but the next segment proved more severe than expected. The ridge connection required sustained climbing over unstable talus and fractured rock, increasing exertion and fluid loss at a critical stage. During the ascent, he slipped and struck his knee on exposed stone, significantly reducing mobility. From that point, both ascent and descent became hazardous due to injury, fatigue, and unstable terrain. His remaining water soon ran out, and he became increasingly disoriented with no reliable communication. He recorded a short video describing his condition before attempting a descent, but progress was slow and limited by injury and exhaustion. Concern was raised when he failed to return on schedule and his vehicle remained at the trailhead, prompting a search operation across the canyon network with ground teams and aerial reconnaissance deployed.
That short recording ends up being the only thing I have to go on once everything else goes quiet.
He was eventually located in a lower drainage zone, conscious but severely dehydrated, with a swollen knee and limited mobility. His condition was critical, with signs of advanced heat illness compounded by prolonged exposure and fluid loss. Although ground teams reached him and began assisted movement out of the canyon, his condition deteriorated rapidly during extraction. The combination of severe dehydration, exertional heat stress, and inability to stabilize his body temperature led to collapse before evacuation could be completed. He was pronounced dead shortly after being transferred to a ranger-accessible point, with medical assessments citing hyperthermia and multi-organ failure consistent with prolonged heat exposure and exertion under dehydration. The incident was later classified as a high-risk backcountry fatality, driven by reliance on unverified algorithmic route planning, compounded by inaccurate environmental assumptions, insufficient emergency preparedness, and delayed effective response once incapacitation occurred. Officials emphasized that digital navigation tools cannot replace field verification in remote desert environments where conditions can shift rapidly. It was September 14, 2015. Renata Colville was in her late 30s when this happened, and she had been climbing for several years by that point. Not decades, years. Enough time to feel genuinely confident, to have a mental list of things she had accomplished, to have developed a personality around the sport. And that right there is where things start to get complicated. Because competence and confidence are not the same thing, and Renata had a lot more of the second one than the first.
Before we get into Renata specifically, I want to paint the picture of where all of this happened because the setting matters enormously here.
We are talking about a massive granite wall in the western United States, one of the most famous climbing destinations in the world, the kind of place that draws people from every country, that shows up in documentaries, that experienced climbers dream about for years before they ever set foot on it. It is enormous in a way that is genuinely hard to describe if you have never stood at the base of it. 3,000 feet of raw stone rising straight up out of the valley floor, catching the morning light in this golden, almost absurd way that makes it look like something out of a painting. Late summer in the western mountains is a tricky time. The days are still long and warm, which makes the climbing comfortable in the early hours, but afternoon thunderstorms can roll in fast, and the temperature swings between sunrise and midday can be significant. The year this happened, sometime around 2017 or 2018, the forecast for the specific days in question was considered favorable. Clear skies, moderate temperatures, low wind, good conditions by any measure. That kind of forecast tends to bring out a lot of climbers, and this particular summer was no exception. The base of the wall and the surrounding trailheads were buzzing with activity in the days leading up to the accident. The route Renata and her her partner had chosen was what climbers call a grade 5 traditional route. That label carries a lot of weight. It means the climb is long enough and serious enough that most parties are expected to sleep on the wall, to haul gear, hang in a tent rigged to the rock face, and continue the next morning. It is not a route for people who are still figuring out the basics. It demands commitment, physical endurance, sound judgment, and a lot of gear. Most experienced parties spend at least one full night on the wall, sometimes two, depending on their pace and the conditions. This is not a day hike with ropes. This is an expedition.
I have to be honest with you, I found Renata difficult to like, even as a subject.
And I think that discomfort is worth sitting with, because she was still a human being, and what happened to her was still a tragedy. But I also think sanitizing who she was would be a disservice to the actual lesson of this story.
I'm gonna tell you who she was as accurately as I can piece it together from the accounts of people who knew her, encountered her, or were present that day.
Renata was, by most accounts, the kind of person who turned every interaction into an opportunity to establish that she knew more than you. She had a background in outdoor recreation and had completed a handful of multi-pitch climbs routes that require multiple rope lengths and some level of technical skill. She was not a beginner, but she was nowhere close to being an expert on something like a major grade 5 wall. The gap between those two things is vast, and it mattered a lot. What made it worse was that Renata genuinely did not seem to believe the gap existed. In online climbing communities, she was known for leaving long, winding comments arguing that regulations were excessive, that fees were a form of exploitation, and that the dangers of climbing were routinely exaggerated by authorities who either did not understand the sport or had some other agenda. She was particularly vocal about what she called government overreach on public land. She had opinions about everything and delivered them at volume. Her climbing partner on this trip was a man named Darwin Marsh. Darwin was quieter, less experienced, and this detail matters deeply conflict averse. He had climbed with Renata before and had noticed her patterns. He knew that pushing back on her tended to create more problems than it solved, so he had developed a strategy of gentle agreement and quiet accommodation, filling in wherever she left gaps, smoothing things over with strangers she had offended, finishing tasks she started and abandoned. It was not a healthy dynamic, and it was going to have real consequences before the day was over. They arrived at the wilderness trailhead before the sun came up, which was actually the right call. Most serious parties start early to maximize daylight on the wall. The parking area was already partially full. A few headlamps bobbed around in the dark as other climbers organized their gear. There was a self-registration permit station near the trailhead, a simple kiosk where you fill out a form, tear off your copy, and go. It takes maybe 5 minutes. Most people treat it as an ordinary part of the process. Renata did not treat it as an ordinary part of the process. Before she had even finished reading the first field on the form, she was already talking loudly. The permit requirement, in her view, was a symptom of everything wrong with how public land was managed. She announced to no one in particular that nobody should need paperwork just to go for a climb, that the whole system existed so agencies could collect data and eventually justify charging people for more things, that it was an infringement on the basic right to access land that belonged to all Americans. Several other climbers nearby shifted uncomfortably. A few exchanged looks.
Nobody said anything, because what do you say to that at 5 in the morning?
She moved through the form the way someone moves through a traffic jam aggressively, with commentary about every obstacle. The emergency contact field particularly annoyed her. She questioned aloud why anyone needed to know who to call if something went wrong.
It struck me when I first read about it as both darkly ironic and genuinely alarming.
Darwin quietly finished most of the form while she monologued. When they finally moved away from the kiosk, a few of the other climbers let out quiet exhales.
I'm not exaggerating when I say that this kind of behavior is a warning sign. Not a moral warning sign, I mean like a practical one.
Someone who cannot move through a 5-minute bureaucratic process without turning it into a political argument is someone whose attention is already fragmented before the climb even begins. The hike to the base of the wall takes a while, and Renata used the time productively if your goal is to stay furious. She worked through a mental list of grievances as they walked. Trail maintenance signs that she found condescending, restrictions on fixed protection that she interpreted as anti-climber sentiment, a posted informational board about recent search and rescue operations in the area that, for reasons I still do not fully understand, made her angry rather than thoughtful. About halfway to the wall, they passed a volunteer steward, one of those people who donate their time to stand near popular trailheads and remind visitors about seasonal closures, wildlife nesting areas, leave no trace practices, practices, that sort of thing. This particular volunteer, a polite young woman, mentioned that a section near the base had a seasonal closure for nesting raptors and gave them a brief description of where the boundaries were. It was the kind of information most climbers nod at and file away. Renata stopped walking. What followed was a brief but excruciating exchange in which Renata informed the volunteer that she was familiar with the rules, that she had been climbing in this area for years.
And this is the part that genuinely gets under my skin, that she had probably been climbing longer than the volunteer had even been alive.
The volunteer was a young woman, maybe mid-20s, and she handled the whole thing with impressive patience. She smiled, said she understood, and wished them a good climb. Renata walked away, still muttering. Dovin said nothing. There is something particularly telling about that interaction. The volunteer was not accusing Renata of anything. She was giving the same information to every climber who passed. Renata's response tells you something important. She was not actually reacting to what was being said. She was reacting to the feeling of being addressed at all, of being included in a general reminder, as though that implied she did not already know. Her ego was the trigger. And once it was triggered, it did not easily reset. By the time they reached the base of the wall, the light had shifted from gray to gold, and other climbers were already there, sorting through enormous haul bags, organizing protection, double-checking systems. There is a particular kind of focused, quiet energy at the base of a serious climb, and most of the people there were deep in it, methodical, unhurried, thorough. Renata and Dovin's setup looked different. Their rack, the collection of gear they would use to protect themselves on the wall, was noticeably smaller than what the other parties had. Their supplies were lean. There was no emergency bivouac equipment visible, no extra layers for the cold that comes at altitude after the sun drops, minimal emergency provisions of any kind. This caught the eye of a climbing ranger who was doing routine patrol in the area. His name is Officer Breslin. He was doing his job that day, and what happened between him and Renata is one of the most important parts of this story. Breslin was experienced. He had seen a lot of parties at the base of this wall, and he had a well-developed sense of what a prepared party looked like versus what a party that was going to need help looked like. Renata and Dovin fell pretty clearly into the second category. He approached them the way rangers are trained to approach climbers, not accusatorially, not dramatically, but conversationally. He asked what route they were planning, whether they intended to push through in a single day, or plan to bivouac on the wall, and what their planned turnaround time was. These are standard questions. They are designed to open a dialogue, not to catch anyone out. Then he explained what he had observed over the years on this particular route. It was longer and more demanding than many people expected going in. Several parties in recent years had needed assistance, some due to equipment issues, some due to exhaustion, some due to weather that moved in faster than the forecast had suggested. Afternoon conditions at elevation could change in ways that were hard to predict. Retreat became genuinely difficult after certain pitches because of the nature of the terrain. He recommended they carry more water. He recommended an emergency shelter. He suggested a more conservative approach to timing. He was measured, specific, and professional. And then Renata started talking.
I want to be clear that I understand the experience of feeling like an authority figure is underestimating you.
I think most of us have been in a situation where someone in a position of power spoke to us as though we were less capable than we actually are, and it feels bad. It can make you defensive in a way that is genuinely hard to control. I understand that impulse. But that is not what was happening here. Breslin was looking at a rack that was objectively under-equipped for what they were planning. He was delivering information that was factually accurate. And even if Renata had disagreed with his assessment, there were about 40 different ways she could have handled it that did not involve what she actually did. She interrupted him before he had finished his recommendations. She accused him of profiling climbers, of looking at them and making assumptions about their competence without any basis. She told him that warnings like this were unnecessary, that public employees always assumed climbers were incompetent, that the whole encounter was a form of intimidation designed to scare people away from the routes they had every right to climb. Her voice got louder. The climbers nearby stopped pretending not to listen. Some of them watched openly. Breslin remained calm. He said, clearly and without escalating, that he was only providing safety information and that they were free to make their own choices. This did not help. Renata raised her voice further. She used the word harassment. She said she knew her rights. She said she paid taxes for this land. She demanded to see his identification, asked for his supervisor's name, and requested information on how to file a formal complaint. The confrontation stretched on for several minutes, much longer than it needed to, much longer than Breslin wanted it to go, and much longer than any of the nearby climbers were comfortable watching. Eventually, Breslin disengaged. Before he walked away, he told them to climb safely. It was a small thing to say, and he said it quietly, but I think about it a lot. He walked away from that interaction knowing there was a real possibility he had just spoken to someone for the last time.
I don't know what that feels like, but I imagine it's pretty heavy.
A few climbers nearby made quiet comments to each other about how the ranger had just been doing his job. Nobody said it to Renata directly, and Renata, still vibrating with fury, began organizing her gear.
Here's the thing about anger that I find genuinely fascinating from a psychological standpoint. It doesn't just live in the moment.
It spreads. It bleeds into the next 30 minutes, the next hour. It fragments your attention in ways you are often not even aware of. Renata was angry in a way that had nowhere to go, and so it went everywhere. For the next half hour, she kept returning to the confrontation. She rehearsed what she was going to write in her complaint. She talked about reporting the ranger. She made a series of increasingly wide claims about how the climbing community was being strangled by regulation, about how public land management had become hostile to individual freedom, about how encounters like this one were a symptom of a much larger problem. Darwin listened and offered small, non-committal sounds of agreement. He was not processing any of it. He was waiting for it to stop. Then another climber, a friendly, well-meaning guy who had been nearby during part of the ranger confrontation, made the mistake of suggesting that Renata might want to consider carrying more water because the temperature was expected to climb significantly through the morning. He said it gently. He said it the way you say something to a stranger that you think might genuinely help them. Renata told him she did not ask for advice, and that everyone suddenly seemed to think they were an expert. He walked away without responding.
I think he made the right call. You can't reason someone out of a state that they didn't reason themselves into.
What I want you to notice is how much energy Renata was burning on all of this. Emotional energy, cognitive energy, attention, all of it was going toward the ranger, toward the complaint she was drafting in her head, toward proving a point that no one around her actually needed her to prove. None of it was going toward what she was about to do, which was tie into a rope and step onto a 3,000-foot wall. There is a concept in psychology sometimes called attentional narrowing, where a strong emotional state causes your focus to collapse inward. You stop processing your environment accurately because your brain is too busy processing the emotional event. It happens to everyone. It happens to surgeons, to pilots, to athletes. The research on it is pretty clear. Strong negative emotions degrade performance on tasks that require careful attention, especially procedural tasks where you are working through a checklist or a sequence of steps. Climbing preparation is almost entirely procedural. You follow a sequence, you check things in a specific order. When that sequence gets disrupted by an emotion that has nowhere to go, errors creep in. Renata was not stupid. She was not careless in some fundamental character sense. She was a person in the grip of a strong emotional state, doing a task that required something she no longer had available to give. By the time they actually sat down to prepare their gear, Renata was behind the mental pace you need to be at before a serious climb. She was rushing through the process not dramatically, not visibly to someone who did not know her, but in ways that Darwin noticed. Her usual methodical approach to sorting protection and checking equipment was abbreviated. Things ended up in the wrong pockets. Steps that she normally followed in a specific order got shuffled or skipped. She was thinking about the ranger. She was thinking about her complaint. She was thinking about everything except what was directly in front of her. Darwin noticed. He noticed that she seemed distracted, that she kept circling back to the confrontation mid-task, that her normally careful rhythm was off. He suggested they take a short break before starting. Just sit down, breathe, let the morning settle. It was a good suggestion. It was, in fact, exactly what they needed to do. Renata refused. She said they needed to get moving.
I'm not going to pretend I don't understand Darwin's position here.
He was in a relationship, a climbing partnership, but with all the social weight that any long-term partnership carries with someone who was not in a place to receive gentle redirection. He had tried. She had said no. What do you do? I am not sure I know the answer, but I think it is worth sitting with the fact that he saw the warning signs and could not find a way to act on them. That is its own kind of tragedy layered inside the main one. This is the part I need you to pay close attention to, because it is the most technically important part of the story, and also the part where everything becomes irreversible. When you climb a technical route and tie yourself to the rope, you use a specific knot called a rethreaded figure-8 follow-through. It is also called a figure-8 on a bite, or sometimes just a rewoven figure-8. The name is descriptive. You tie a figure-8 shape in the rope, then thread the tail back through the original knot, retracing its path until the finished product looks like a symmetric, doubled figure-8 pressed flat. It is the standard tie-in knot used by the vast majority of rock climbers worldwide. It is simple, strong, reliable, and almost impossible to get wrong if you do it slowly and pay attention. Almost. Renata began tying in, and while she was doing it, she was talking. She was still processing the ranger confrontation, still working through the argument, still rehearsing lines. She threaded the rope through her harness tie-in points and started forming the figure 8. Then her attention drifted back to the morning's events. She paused, mid-process, to say something to Darwin. Then she came back to the knot and continued, or rather, she thought she continued. What she actually did was pick up from a point in the process that was not where she had left off. She believed she had finished rethreading the knot. She had not. The tail of the rope had not been fully traced back through the original figure 8. The resulting knot was not obviously wrong. It was a partially completed figure 8 follow-through, and at a casual glance, especially partially obscured by the harness and the extra rope, it looked close enough to correct that she did not catch it. Because she believed she had already finished the knot, it did not occur to her to look carefully. She did not check it a second time. And then there was the buddy check, which is exactly what it sounds like. You check each other. Harness buckles doubled back, belay device rigged correctly, tie-in knot completed, and dressed properly. You look at your partner's setup and they look at yours, and you confirm out loud that everything is in order. It is one of the most fundamental safety practices in climbing. It exists precisely because of moments like this one, moments where distraction or assumption might cause someone to miss their own error. The buddy check is the backstop. Neither of them did it. Darwin did not check Renata's knot. Renata did not ask him to. Whether this was because the whole morning had been too chaotic, or because she was too proud to invite scrutiny after the argument about competence, or simply because the normal rhythm of preparation had been disrupted by everything that came before, I do not know. Probably some combination. But the rope was tied, or seemed to be tied, and they started climbing. The first few pitches went fine. This is the most uncomfortable part of the story for me, honestly, because it means there was a long window during which they could have caught the mistake and did not. Each successful pitch reinforced the belief that everything was working correctly. Renata climbed confidently. The knot was not subjected to the kind of sudden, heavy loading that would have immediately exposed the problem. The early pitches did not require her to take any significant falls. She moved well, placed protection, called out to Darwin, hauled gear, everything looked normal. As they moved higher, the wall changed character. The terrain became more serious. Retreat stopped being a realistic option. Several pitches up, not impossible, but complicated enough that most parties at that point committed to continuing upward. And here is the uncomfortable reality of how commitment works on a big wall. There is a point where going down costs roughly the same effort as going up, and then a point where going down costs more. Once you cross that second threshold, you are psychologically and practically all in. Every foot of elevation you gain deepens that commitment. Renata and Darwin had passed that threshold without either of them saying so out loud. They were hundreds of feet above the ground by this point. Fully invested, the valley floor spread out far below them in that vertiginous way that either thrills you or terrifies you depending on your relationship with height.
I have never been that high on a wall, and I genuinely can't imagine what the world actually looks like from up there. But I know that at that altitude, the margin for error is essentially zero.
The unfinished knot had been there the whole time, waiting. They reached a section that was harder than what they had been climbing, a stretch where the rock offered fewer obvious holds, where the moves required more precision, where a moment of imbalance was easier to come by. Renata was working through it. At some point, she shifted her weight in a way that took her off balance, and she fell. Under normal circumstances, this would be an ordinary event. Climbers fall, the rope catches them, they collect themselves, rest for a moment, and try again. The entire system, the knot, the harness, the protection on the wall, the belay device in Darwin's hands, is designed for exactly this scenario. But the knot was not a knot. It was a shape that resembled a knot. When Renata's weight came onto the rope suddenly and with force, the incomplete figure 8 deformed. Under load, a partially retraced figure 8 does not hold the way a completed one does. The tail pulled through. The rope disconnected from her harness. She fell from the wall. Climbers on adjacent routes heard it before they saw it, shouting not the normal communication shouts between climbing partners, but something sharper, more alarmed. They looked toward the route. Several of them were on the phone with emergency services before they could fully process what they had seen. Darwin, above on the belay, was unable to comprehend immediately what had happened. The rope had gone slack in a way that made no sense. For a moment, he simply did not understand. Search and rescue personnel responded as quickly as the terrain allowed. The area around the accident site was temporarily closed. Investigators arrived and began the methodical work of reconstructing what had happened. The physical evidence was clear. The rope was intact. The harness showed no signs of failure. The protection on the wall held. When they examined the tie-in, they found what they had feared. A figure 8 follow-through that had never been completed. The tail had not been fully traced back through the original knot. It was a preparation error, not an equipment failure. Nothing had broken. The gear had done nothing wrong.
I've thought a lot about what this story means, and I keep coming back to the same uncomfortable place.
The incomplete knot was the technical cause of the accident, but it didn't happen in isolation. It was tied by someone whose attention had been consumed by anger, who dismissed advice and treated every warning as an attack. It was September 18th, 2013. The canyon floor was still reaching the mid-90s during the day, but nighttime temperatures near the south rim had fallen into the low 40s. In the narrow side canyons, cold air settled and lingered overnight. Without the right gear, staying warm could become a serious problem very quickly. Portia Graybell was 48 years old and worked as a logistics coordinator in Denver, Colorado. She had used map applications to navigate everywhere for years and trusted them completely. She downloaded a hiking app 2 days before the trip, had no backcountry hiking experience, and no wilderness navigation training. She packed a hydration pack with 2 liters of water, a protein bar, a light zip-up jacket, and nothing else. She checked into her lodging the night before, told the front desk she was planning to do a morning hike, and left it at that.
The entire hike was built around a single assumption, that the app was right. I just don't see much evidence that Portia ever seriously questioned it or even had a backup plan if it turned out to be wrong.
She started on the Bright Angel Trail at 8 that morning, intending to reach the rest stop at the 3-mile mark and return. About a mile and a half in, she noticed a narrow drainage canyon branching off to the west. There was no sign or marked trail and no obvious path. Her hiking app, however, showed what looked like a route cutting through the drainage and reconnecting with the main trail farther down. Another hiker told her it was not a real trail. Portia pointed at the app, said it was showing one, and headed into the drainage anyway. She entered the side canyon at around 9:10 in the morning. The terrain inside was immediately more difficult than it appeared from the trail. Loose rock, dry sand, walls that narrowed within the first quarter mile. The route her app showed did not correspond to anything on the ground. She kept moving, assuming the terrain would open up ahead. About 40 minutes in the canyon, narrowed to a point where continuing required climbing down a dry fall, a vertical rock drop of roughly 12 feet. She looked at it, checked her app one more time, and climbed down. Below the dry fall, the walls rose steeply on both sides. She could not climb back up without assistance. She checked her app again. The suggested route still showed her on a path. She kept going. By 11 in the morning, she had been moving through the drainage for nearly 2 hours. The physical exertion of navigating loose terrain in rising heat had already taken a significant toll. She finished both liters of water at around 11:40. She attempted to retrace her steps, but the canyon had branched in 2 places and she had taken a wrong turn on her return. By early afternoon, she was moving through a section she had not previously entered. Her app had no signal inside the narrow walls. The route remained on the map, but nothing around her matched what it was showing. She sat down in a shaded section of the canyon floor at around 2 in the afternoon. The temperature around her was 91 degrees, but dropping as the walls blocked the sun completely. She was severely dehydrated, nauseated, and her legs had started cramping. She ate the protein bar.
For all the confidence she placed in the app, it ended up being the first thing to disappear when she actually needed it. After that, she was left with nothing but the consequences of trusting it.
As the afternoon became evening, the temperature dropped sharply. By 7, it was 53 degrees Fahrenheit in the drainage. By 10, it had fallen to 41. Portia had a light zip-up jacket and nothing else. Her body was already significantly weakened by dehydration and heat exhaustion, which meant her ability to generate and retain heat as the temperature dropped was already compromised before the cold even set in. Hypothermia in that context does not announce itself the way people expect it to. The body just gets quieter and quieter until it stops. Portia had not specified which trail she was taking when she checked in. Her vehicle was noted in the trailhead parking area the following morning by a maintenance worker who had seen it there the previous day. A report was filed and a search was initiated covering the Bright Angel Trail and the immediate surrounding area. The side canyon she had entered was not identified as a search zone until a drainage survey was conducted on the second day. On the morning of September 20th, a search team located her body approximately 1 mile into the side canyon below the dry fall. She had been dead for an estimated 30 to 36 hours. She was found seated against the canyon wall, jacket zipped, knees drawn to her chest. The protein bar wrapper was beside her. Both water compartments were empty. Her phone was recovered and partially restored. GPS logs showed her departure point from the main trail and a fragmented track through the drainage before signal was lost. The hiking app was identified as a consumer product, with no verified backcountry data for that section of the canyon. The route it had suggested did not correspond to any navigable terrain. The statement from the hiker who told her there was no trail in the drainage became the last confirmed account of anyone speaking with Portia before she left the main trail. Authorities determined that she died after becoming lost off the main trail, with no evidence of any other contributing factors. It was September 7th, 2018 in Death Valley National Park. A remote stretch of dunes, dry washes, and unmaintained tracks formed an exposed corridor where survival margins narrowed under late summer heat. Pale sand and clay reflected intense heat with little shade or landmarks beyond the road. Kishan Oren was 31, based out of San Diego. He was big into endurance running, the kind of guy who turns long desert runs into content for his audience online. He had experience with distance and training, but Death Valley, especially sustained heat like this, was something he hadn't really tested himself in before. His logistics partner, Brent Messias, 34, helped set things up. Route planning, support setup, and a mid-route water cache to make the attempt possible. A few weeks before the run, Kishan picks a 38-mile Death Valley route after reviewing satellite images and online footage. It looks doable to him, like a solid one-push endurance challenge.
If it were me, I'd be careful how much I trust something like this off satellite images alone. I also start thinking about how much detail doesn't carry over when everything is flattened into a screen view.
He even turns it into a live stream event, with planned water drops along the way. And there's also this underlying pressure trying to prove himself again after earlier criticism that didn't sit right with him. The planning underestimated how quickly Death Valley conditions intensify under direct sun, and how misleading satellite imagery can be in showing elevation and drainage.
I keep thinking about how clean everything looks on a screen compared to how unstable it actually is.
On the morning of the attempt, he began the run on livestream with steady early progress, but as temperatures rose, reflected heat from the pale terrain rapidly increased physical strain. By late morning, Oren's water consumption increased faster than planned, and his pace began to decline. Viewers noted visible strain through the livestream, including longer pauses and reduced clarity in speech. Despite this, he continued forward, emphasizing that stopping would compromise the attempt and the commitment made to his audience. A critical failure occurred at the first scheduled supply point along a desert road crossing. The water cache, intended as a primary hydration resupply, had been placed at an incorrect junction due to a mapping error during setup. When Kishan arrived, the supplies were absent. After an extended search of the area, he was forced to continue with significantly reduced hydration. At this stage, dehydration began accelerating, and early heat illness symptoms emerged, including confusion, impaired judgment, and reduced coordination. Instead of retreating along the road, Kishan committed to continuing the route toward a secondary water source marked on his map, unaware it was unreliable and seasonally dry. By early afternoon, his movement had slowed to a strained walk. Speech became fragmented, and he began showing clear signs of progressing heat stroke. He consumed his remaining water and reached the mapped water source, which was completely dry. At that point, cognitive impairment was already advanced. Although he had emergency communication equipment available, he did not initiate a full distress signal immediately. His judgment was increasingly affected by dehydration, confusion, and a distorted perception of remaining capability, leading him to underestimate the severity of his condition. Instead of calling for evacuation right away, he tries to check himself first. Just a quick self-assessment, trying to figure out how bad things really are. Then he keeps moving a bit, slowly looking for anything shade, a better spot, somewhere he might get a signal or just be able to communicate more clearly.
I'm just watching him burn time here, trying small fixes when the bigger problem is already set.
But that choice ends up costing time, and in that window, things start to slip even more. His thinking gets less structured, harder to organize, and the delay builds on itself, making it even tougher to respond in a clear, decisive way. As his condition worsened, he struggled to complete basic operational steps under heat stress, including focusing on instructions and maintaining attention long enough to follow through with a full emergency transmission. By the time he attempted to escalate the situation, his cognitive state had already degraded to the point where communication was fragmented and incomplete. The delay meant that when emergency services were finally contacted through a third-party viewer, responders had to rely on limited, indirect location data rather than a precise real-time distress signal. This increased the time required to narrow the search area within the canyon system. Emergency services were alerted after a viewer contacted authorities during the live stream. Search teams launched immediately, with aerial units deployed once his last known location was confirmed through tracking data. Rescuers found him later that afternoon unconscious, showing signs of severe hyperthermia consistent with advanced heat stroke. Despite rapid cooling and evacuation to a regional hospital, his condition was irreversible, and he was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Investigators cited multiple contributing factors, including insufficient hydration planning for Death Valley conditions, a critical navigation error that mispositioned water supplies, and delayed emergency activation. The live stream was also identified as a contributing pressure factor, influencing continued exertion despite clear signs of physiological decline. The recording later circulated widely, prompting renewed scrutiny of endurance challenges in extreme desert environments and the risks of prioritizing performance over survival limits. It was August 3rd, 2017. The South Kaibab Trail dropped 7 miles from the south rim to the Colorado River, losing nearly 5,000 feet along an open ridgeline with no shade and no water for its entire length. At 6 in the morning, the rim was 78 degrees Fahrenheit. By early afternoon, the canyon floor would hit 116. Rosie Ormond was 47 years old and sold real estate in Scottsdale, Arizona. She had spent her entire adult life in the desert, and that fact mattered to her more than it should have. Phoenix summers hit 110 degrees regularly, and she had always been fine. What she did not account for was that canyon heat and city heat are two entirely different things, and the South Kaibab Trail does not care what you think you are used to.
She thought she understood heat because she'd lived with it for years. The canyon was about to show her the real difference.
She started her descent at 6:40 in the morning with 2 16-ounce water bottles and a bag of trail mix in a small shoulder bag. At Cedar Ridge, about a mile and a half down, a sign warned hikers not to continue toward the river without at least 4 liters of water and a turnaround plan before 10 in the morning. 2 hikers resting there pointed it out to her. She told them the morning felt fine and that she had been dealing with desert heat her whole life. She was walking again before they finished responding. Below Cedar Ridge, the trail narrows along an exposed ridgeline with the canyon dropping away on both sides. Rosie moved through that section steadily, finishing both water bottles before reaching the tip-off at roughly 4.5 miles in. No shade, no water source, temperature already at 97 degrees. She kept going. She reached the river just before 11 in the morning after more than 4 hours of hiking. The canyon floor was sitting at 108 degrees. She had been without water for the last 2 miles of descent, and it showed. She was moving stiffly when the backpackers first saw her, her face deeply flushed, and she sat down heavily at the water's edge without saying anything to anyone. One of the backpackers brought her a full water bottle and an electrolyte packet without being asked. She drank most of the water and handed the packet back. He told her she needed it in that heat. She said she did not do supplements and that she didn't believe in that stuff. She rested for about 30 minutes, finished the water, and stood up to leave. The same backpacker told her the temperature was still climbing and offered 2 more bottles for the climb back up. She took 1 bottle and told him she'd be fine with that, said she had a long drive back to Scottsdale and needed to get going.
What's me is that she still seemed to think that this was something she could simply push through. The people around her saw the warning signs, but Rosie seemed more focused on just getting back to Scottsdale that night instead.
The backpackers watched her start up the trail. She stopped 4 times in the first quarter mile, hands on her knees, before disappearing around a bend. 2 of them considered going after her, but they were carrying full packs and had their own miles ahead. They noted the time and hoped she would be okay.
The climb back gains 5,000 feet over 7 miles of fully exposed trail in 108-degree heat after 4 hours of descent with 1 borrowed bottle and no electrolytes. The body is already behind before the first step upward.
40 minutes into her climb, a solo hiker coming down found her sitting on the trail, head drooping forward. He spoke to her and she looked up but could not form words. Her skin was hot and dry, her breathing fast and audible. He gave her the rest of his water, sat down next to her, and kept talking to keep her present. She responded a few times in single words and then stopped responding altogether. He sent a distress signal on his satellite communicator at 12:17 in the afternoon. She lost consciousness shortly after. A second hiker reached them within minutes, and the 2 alternated chest compressions for close to 15 minutes before ground personnel arrived from a camp roughly a mile away. No defibrillator was available. Ground personnel took over resuscitation on site. A helicopter was delayed by a narrow approach corridor and high crosswinds in that section of the canyon. She was airlifted once a stable approach was possible and pronounced dead at a medical facility. The coroner listed cause of death as cardiac arrest from exertional heat stroke. Her core temperature at rescue was 107.2 degrees Fahrenheit. No conditions were found that would have caused cardiac arrest independently. The backpackers provided written accounts covering her arrival, her condition at the river, and the exchange over the electrolytes and the second water bottle. The satellite communicator log confirmed the distress signal timestamp. Both of her original water bottles were recovered empty at the riverbank. The case was ruled accidental. The South Kaibab took Rosie because she trusted the wrong thing about herself. On the Hermit Trail that same season, a woman with 2 previous canyon hikes under her belt treated that history like a guarantee. This story starts in July 16, 2019, with 4 gym buddies named Mason Price, Derek Alvarez, Silas Crane, and Tobias Renner. Mason was 29, Derek was 31, Silas was 28, Tobias was 30. They'd been training together for years at the same gym, and from what people who knew them said, they were the kind of friends who couldn't just lift weights together without turning it into some kind of contest. Who could bench more? Who could run faster? Who could go longer without eating before a workout?
You could pick literally anything, and these four had probably already argued about it. At some point, the conversation turned to endurance, and somebody brought up Death Valley. You've probably heard of it, even if you've never been close to it.
It's one of the hottest places on the planet during the summer, with temperatures that regularly climb past 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Mason, Derek, Silas, and Tobias heard about how brutal the heat could get out there, and instead of filing that away as a fun fact, they turned it into a bet. Whoever gave up first on a hike through the park would owe the other three an entire year of gym membership fees.
I want to pause right here because this is the part that gets me every time I think about it. A year of membership fees is, what, maybe $600?
800 if the gym is fancy. These four were about to risk their lives over something you could solve by just paying for your own membership and not betting it. That's the thing about competitive friendship sometimes. The stakes don't even have to make sense. It's never really about the money. It's about not being the one who backs down.
Here's where it also gets really interesting for me, and honestly also a little bit disturbing.
These four didn't just wake up one day and drive out to the desert. They spent almost 3 weeks planning this thing. Most of that planning focused on the challenge itself. They wanted an empty trail, uninterrupted footage, and a chance to prove they could handle conditions that most people avoided. Part of that meant not advertising the plan to people who might try to talk them out of it.
Think about that for a second.
They weren't breaking rules or entering restricted areas. The four hikers believed they were skilled and prepared enough to handle conditions that others couldn't. Despite repeatedly encountering warnings against strenuous hiking in extreme heat, they viewed those warnings as being meant for less capable people, not themselves. They thoroughly researched the trail, weather, maps, and trip reports, but ultimately underestimated the danger of the heat.
I think this is where their thinking went completely sideways, and it's worth sitting with for a second. Most people read a warning like that and think, okay, I shouldn't go.
These four read the same warning and thought, great, that means the trail will be empty. They took a list of reasons to stay away and flipped it into a list of reasons the plan would work. It's such a small shift in thinking, but it changes everything that happens after. During planning, the four men saw the extreme heat as an advantage rather than a danger. With fewer visitors during heat waves, they expected an empty trail where they could carry out their challenge without interference. To avoid encountering others, they chose a remote trail, picked a Tuesday instead of a busy weekend, and planned to start before sunrise. Their decisions were aimed at minimizing contact with anyone who might discourage them from continuing.
Now, before I go further into the story, I want to know your first reaction to hearing that they were actively trying to avoid people who might talk them out of it. Let me know in the comments.
Honestly, this part bugs me more than almost anything else in this story. They did real research, they weren't lazy about it, they just used all that information backward. It's like reading a manual on how a bomb works and concluding the best plan is to stand closer to it. As they researched more, their confidence grew instead of their caution. Studying maps, forecasts, and trail information gave them a false sense of expertise, leading them to believe that their fitness and gym experience would protect them from the desert's dangers. They increasingly viewed heat warnings as advice for unprepared tourists rather than for people like themselves. They also concealed key details from family and friends, describing the trip as ordinary sightseeing rather than a competitive challenge. They avoided discussing the wager, the specific trail, or their plans online, hoping to prevent experienced hikers from discouraging them. Their intention was to document the challenge and reveal it afterward as proof of the outcome. By the final week before the hike, isolation wasn't just a side effect of their planning anymore. It had become the goal. They pictured an empty trail where nobody could interrupt their competition. Nobody could see either of them quit, and nobody could tell them they'd gone too far. And here's the tragic irony of the whole thing. Every single safeguard they removed from their own plan was also a potential source of help that they were throwing away without realizing it. And the worst part is that their plan worked. It worked almost perfectly. The morning they set out, they barely saw anyone. No ranger happened to be in the area that morning, which wasn't unusual given the sheer size of Death Valley and how few people were hiking remote trails during extreme heat. No experienced hiker on the trail questioned their route or their timing. No friend called partway through the day to check in. All that privacy they worked so hard to build for themselves ended up meaning that when things started going wrong, there was nobody nearby who could recognize it and step in. Before they even started hiking, the four of them sat down and came up with a set of rules for their competition. And reading through what investigators later pieced together from their footage, these rules are almost unbelievable in how reckless they were. Not one of them was allowed to voluntarily quit without losing the bet outright. Any rest stop longer than 5 minutes counted as a sign of weakness. Any complaint about the heat or about being tired was treated as nothing more than an excuse. Every major checkpoint along the route had to be filmed as proof they'd actually reached it. And whoever made it to the turnaround point first would get extra bragging rights on top of winning the bet. So basically, in the span of a few sentences, a goofy competition between friends turned into a set of rules that actively punished either one of them for admitting they were struggling.
That's the part that really gets under my skin. They built a system where the smart decision, stopping, resting, turning around, was treated as failure.
They engineered their own peer pressure into the trip before they'd even taken a single step. They started hiking before the sun came up, just like they'd planned. For the first several miles, everything felt easy. The temperature was still relatively bearable in those early hours, and all 4 of them were full of energy. Their phones captured non-stop trash talk between them. Mason bragged that years of heavy lifting and serious conditioning had basically prepared him for anything the desert could throw at him. Derek pushed back, insisting that mental toughness mattered way more than any hydration plan or safety precaution. Silas claimed his trail experience put him a step ahead of everyone else. Tobias just laughed and said he'd settle the whole argument by finishing first.
Watching this part of the footage, if you didn't know how the story ended, you'd think you were watching 4 confident athletes treating a desert hike just like another gym challenge.
They laughed at the warning signs posted along the trail about extreme heat. They joked that people online had clearly exaggerated how bad it could get. The trail being nearly empty only made them more confident, because to them, every mile they covered without seeing another soul felt like proof their planning had paid off. At several points in the footage, they comment on how few people they've seen out there. Mason jokes that the whole park basically belongs to them now. Derek responds that this is exactly why they picked a weak forecast to experience some of the most extreme temperatures of the summer to do this.
I think this moment is honestly the saddest part of the early footage, even though nothing bad has really happened yet.
Not one of them understood that the emptiness around them wasn't a reward for being tough. It was a warning that almost everyone else had already decided the conditions were unsafe, and they were the only 4 who hadn't gotten the message yet. Once the sun actually rose, everything started changing fast. The landscape around them began throwing heat back at them from every direction. There were long stretches of trail with almost no shade anywhere in sight. Sweat poured off all 4 of them, and within a relatively short stretch of time, their shirts were completely soaked through. Derek noticed he was drinking a lot more water than he'd planned for. Mason developed a headache, but brushed it off as just normal exertion from the hike. Silas started favoring one leg slightly, but didn't say anything. Tobias felt his pace slipping, but kept pushing to stay even with the others. Their conversations got shorter. The joking that had filled the early morning faded out. None of them said out loud that the effort was becoming harder than they'd expected. Instead, each guy looked at the others struggling and saw it as proof that the competition was actually working the way it was supposed to. The trail stayed mostly empty through this stretch. Hours passed without any real contact with another person. What had felt like freedom earlier in the morning now meant there was nobody around to notice just how quickly things were changing for the 4 of them. Heat radiated straight up from the sun-baked rock and dirt under their boots, and the ground itself seemed to be holding onto that warmth and throwing it right back at them. Like the whole desert was cooking them from every angle at once.
This is the point in the story where if you'd be a somewhat reasonable person, you would have turned around.
The headache, the sweat, the sudden water consumption, those are your body's early warning lights. But because they'd built this whole competition around punishing weakness, none one of them could let themselves see those warning signs for what they actually were. As the temperature kept climbing, the whole thing got more aggressive. The 4 of them started racing certain stretches of the trail. Whenever one guy stopped for even a brief moment, the others pushed ahead without him. Small breaks that should have been opportunities to rest turned into chances to gain an advantage in the competition. When Derek suggested taking a longer break at one point, Mason immediately mocked him for it on camera. When Mason started breathing heavily, climbing a steep section, Derek accused him of slowing down on purpose. When Silas asked if anyone else was feeling dizzy, Tobias brushed it off as nothing. None of them wanted to look weaker than the others, and their decisions, every single one of them at this point, were being driven by pride instead of by what their bodies were actually telling them. The environment that had felt totally manageable before sunrise now felt openly hostile. The air kept getting hotter with every hour that passed. Heat radiated up from the ground while the sun beat straight down on them from above, basically squeezing them between 2 sources of heat. And still, no one was willing to admit out loud that maybe they had underestimated exactly what the desert could do to them.
I keep coming back to this idea of pride overriding instinct, because I think it's the actual core of this whole tragedy. These weren't dumb guys.
They were fit, they were prepared on paper, they did their research. But pride is sneaky. It convinces you that admitting weakness is more dangerous than the actual physical danger you're standing in. And by this point in the hike, that's exactly the trap they'd fallen into. By mid-morning, all four of them realized they'd gone through way more water than they had planned for. Before the hike even started, each of them had packed roughly 2 gallons. During their research, they'd seen recommendations suggesting that extreme summer conditions could require far more water than that, especially on exposed routes, but everyone convinced themselves that their fitness and early start would make those estimates overly cautious. At the time, 2 gallons had seemed like more than enough. But a few hours into the heat, all 4 of them were shocked at how fast their supplies were disappearing. And instead of treating this discovery as a reason to slow down or turn back, it sparked a whole new competition between them. Rather than having an honest conversation about how to manage the situation safely, everyone became fixated on proving they were handling the heat better than the others. Derek started quietly rationing his water without saying anything. Mason started sneaking bigger gulps whenever nobody was watching. Silas began hiding how much he had left, while Tobias started timing his sips so the others wouldn't notice how thirsty he really was. They kept checking each other's bottles throughout the day. Nobody wanted to admit any concern, because in their minds, showing concern was basically the same thing as surrendering.
Gotta be honest, I shook my head on this one.
Because running out of water faster than expected in Death Valley in the summer should be an obvious, flashing red alarm. It's not a small detail. It's basically the most important warning your body and your supplies can give you out there, and these 4 looked at that warning and decided it was just another obstacle to push through rather than a reason to stop. As the temperature pushed toward genuinely dangerous levels, the first serious symptoms started showing up. Mason developed worsening headaches, along with occasional dizziness. Derek started getting painful muscle cramps in his legs. Silas began losing his balance on flat ground. Tobias started slurring his words without noticing. All of them became increasingly irritable, started making small mistakes they normally wouldn't have made, and found themselves arguing over minor issues that hadn't seemed important earlier in the morning. Their pace noticeably slowed down. The video clips they were still recording got shorter, because by this point, just talking required real effort. Long silences started appearing between the recordings. In one clip, Mason struggled to remember a distance estimate he himself had mentioned earlier that same day. In another, Derek just pauses for several seconds, clearly trying to recall what the next checkpoint on their route was supposed to be. In one of Silas's last clear recordings, he repeats the same sentence twice without realizing it. Tobias, in his, just stares at the camera for several seconds before saying anything at all. All of them laughed these moments off when they happened. What made the situation especially dangerous was that the warning signs weren't arriving one at a time. Forgetfulness, irritability, poor decisions, physical exhaustion, and misplaced confidence were all beginning to overlap and reinforce one another. No one recognized them as warning signs, even though to anyone watching from the outside, and especially to anyone who knows anything about heat illness, those moments are about as clear a red flag as you can get. The heat at this point was becoming genuinely overwhelming. Temperatures kept rising while the 4 of them stayed out in the open, with basically no real protection from the sun. Mason kept pulling out the trail map and studying it, but he was struggling to interpret information that he'd reviewed in detail before the hike even started. Derek kept forgetting where he'd packed certain pieces of equipment in his own backpack. Silas kept asking the others how far they'd already gone, even though he'd asked minutes before. Tobias kept stopping to check a checkpoint marker that wasn't actually there yet. Simple conversations between them started turning into arguments. They debated distances they had already covered together. They disagreed about how much water was actually left between them. They kept asking each other questions that had already been answered just minutes earlier. Mason noticed that Derek was becoming unusually forgetful and irritable, but he chalked it up to exhaustion, making his friend dramatic. Derek noticed Mason struggling with basic navigation decisions, but he dismissed it as Mason just being stubborn. Silas noticed Tobias slurring his words, but figured he was just tired. Tobias noticed Silas stumbling, but assumed he'd twisted his ankle. None of them stopped to consider that they were all actively showing signs of heat-related cognitive impairment.
I want to slow down here for a second because I want to stress out that heat exhaustion and heat stroke don't just hurt your body.
They hurt your brain. They mess with your ability to recognize that something is wrong in the first place. So you end up with this horrible situation where the exact thing that's putting you in danger is also the thing stealing away your ability to notice the danger. These 4 weren't just getting physically weaker. Their judgment, the one tool that could have saved them, was breaking down right along with everything else. By late morning, all 4 men were showing obvious signs of severe heat stress, and yet none of them believed they were actually in serious danger. Mason kept insisting on camera that he felt fine, even while he was visibly stumbling on flat ground. Derek laughed off his own symptoms, claiming he'd pushed through worse during regular gym workouts. Silas insisted his balance issues were just an old knee injury acting up. Tobias claimed he was talking slow on purpose, like it was some kind of joke. Their videos from this stretch capture increasingly irrational conversations. They talked about completing extra mileage after finishing the challenge, like they were planning some kind of victory lap. They made wildly unrealistic estimates about how quickly they could finish the rest of the route. To anyone watching this footage afterward, it's obvious almost instantly that none of them was thinking clearly anymore. But to the four of them, in that moment, everything still felt completely manageable. As the temperature kept climbing, all of their phones started showing overheating warnings after extended periods of recording in direct sunlight. Recording became more and more sporadic as the devices repeatedly shut down the camera function until they could cool back down. Even their equipment was struggling to survive out there, and somehow that still didn't register as a sign for any of them to stop. Eventually, the tension between them boiled over completely. Mason started blaming Derek for encouraging the challenge in the first place. Derek blamed Mason for picking an overly ambitious route. Silas blamed Tobias for talking everyone into a remote trail instead of a marked one. Tobias blamed Silas for insisting they push through midday instead of resting in the shade. They accused each other of wasting water. They accused each other of slowing down the pace and dragging the whole thing out. The argument kept escalating and getting more confused as it went. None of them could really articulate what they were even upset about anymore. Small, minor grievances turned into full-blown confrontations. Eventually, the argument shifted toward their remaining water and what direction they should take next. Derek wanted to slow down and reconsider the route. Mason accused him of using that as an excuse to quit. Derek fired back that Mason had pushed them too far into the heat. Silas sided with Mason, Tobias sided with Derek. After several increasingly confused arguments about water, pace, and navigation, the group split into two pairs, each one going their own direction. Each of them had convinced himself that the others were the entire reason the day had gone so badly.
I want you to imagine that scenario. Four guys who started the day as best friends and training partners ended up splitting apart from each other.
Alone, in one of the hottest places on Earth, because their judgment had deteriorated to the point where teaming up felt worse than going it alone.
If there's a single decision in this entire story that sealed their fate, I think it's this one.
Once they separated, all four of their conditions got worse fast. Mason kept recording occasional updates on his phone, and honestly, the footage from this stretch is hard to watch. He repeats the same observations multiple times without seeming to realize he's already said them. He struggles to hold the phone steady, his speech becomes increasingly disorganized and hard to follow. At one point in the recordings, he even seems uncertain about which direction he's actually traveling in. Investigators later determined that he gradually wandered away from the route they had originally planned, likely without even realizing it. Silas, who'd paired off with Mason, his final recordings show him sitting motionless for long stretches, occasionally mumbling about needing to catch up to the others. Derek's decline looked a little different. He started sitting down repeatedly for what he believed were just brief rests, but each stop ended up lasting longer than the one before it. He began leaving pieces of equipment behind along the trail because carrying them simply felt too exhausting. Investigators later used those abandoned items to piece together a rough timeline of his decline as the day went on. His final recordings are full of long pauses and incomplete thoughts that just trail off. Several recordings he apparently tried to make were never even completed because his phone kept overheating after sitting exposed to direct sunlight on the open trail. Tobias, paired with Derek, drifted away from him gradually, the two losing sight of each other without either one noticing exactly when it happened.
Can't even begin to imagine how alone they all were by this point, even though they'd started the morning literally side by side.
The whole point of their plan had been privacy, no interference, no witnesses, and now here they were, each one fading away separately, with nobody around to notice and absolutely nobody to help. By early afternoon, all four men were suffering from severe heat illness, with many of the symptoms later believed by investigators to be consistent with heat stroke, and none of them was capable of making sound decisions anymore. Basic movement had become incredibly difficult. Distances that should have taken just minutes to cover stretched out far longer than that. Their remaining water disappeared completely. The videos from this point on are fragmented and confusing, with large gaps appearing between recordings. None of them fully acknowledged just how severe the situation had become. All of them kept holding on to the belief that they could recover after resting just a little bit longer. None of them did. When Mason, Derek, Silas, and Tobias didn't come home that night, their families eventually reported them missing. Search teams started retracing likely routes through the park, but the investigation initially had to consider several possible paths Since none of the families had any idea about the wager or the specific challenge the four men had actually planned, all they'd been told was that it was a simple sightseeing trip. Searchers eventually located all four men, scattered miles apart from each other, exactly where their decision to split up had left them. They were dead for multiple hours already. Their phones held dozens of short video clips, interrupted recordings, GPS data, and timestamps documenting that slow slide from confidence at sunrise to confusion by the afternoon. Using GPS data, the abandoned gear scattered along the trail, timestamps from the videos, and the footage itself, investigators were able to reconstruct large portions of the day's events, although significant gaps remained where no recordings existed and none of the men were present to explain exactly what happened. What that footage ultimately revealed is that none of them died because of one single mistake. They spent hours making increasingly poor decisions while their judgment slowly broke down in the extreme heat, one small bad call after another, until there was nothing left to fall back on. A challenge that started as a test of who had more endurance ended up becoming something much darker, a demonstration of just how fast even four genuinely fit, capable guys can lose the ability to recognize danger once heat illness really takes hold.
And that, to me, is the whole reason this story has stuck. It wasn't recklessness in one big dramatic moment. It was recklessness built quietly, decision by decision, until there was no way out left.
It was June 22nd, 2013, in Death Valley National Park. The Badlands there are a maze of clay ridges and gullies. From above, it can look flat and harmless, especially in satellite images, but on the ground, it's very different. Everything reflects heat, and the pale rock just throws it right back at you. It builds fast, and it gets intense. Melanie Cosley, she was 26, a travel and lifestyle creator based in Phoenix. She was really into desert photography, that off-grid, hidden place kind of aesthetic. Her boyfriend, Jovan Thill, 29, sometimes helped her film, but he didn't have much experience in extreme environments like that, especially not dry desert heat like Death Valley. A few weeks before the trip, Melanie finds a drone clip online of the Badlands and assumes it's something remote, like a proper backcountry hike. But in reality, it wasn't. It was shot near a roadside pullout, just a short walk from the car.
I get why that mistake happens, because from above, everything in that terrain can look way more isolated than it actually is.
Still, she treats it like this hidden, untouched landscape. She lines up a small sponsorship for a shoot, planning it around that golden hour light. And she doesn't really check in with park staff or fully take in just how extreme the heat can get there.
This is why I start thinking about how often people underestimate just how aggressive that heat gets.
On arrival, they carried minimal water and entered the terrain in temperatures exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit. What appeared as open ground quickly broke into steep gullies and narrow clay ridges, forcing repeated detours. Navigation based on a saved satellite image soon became unreliable due to a lack of stable reference points. As they moved deeper into the Badlands, the environment shifted from difficult to disorienting. Gullies deepened into narrow channels that required constant climbing, descending, and backtracking. Their position relative to the road became increasingly uncertain. Water supplies declined faster than anticipated, while early heat strain began to affect both individuals, marked by fatigue, reduced coordination, and slowed decision-making. By the middle of the afternoon, they reach what they think is the right ridge, but it's not. It's a smaller outcrop, still a few hundred meters short of their goal. From there, things get more serious. A drop-off, then more exposed terrain that's rough even in normal conditions, and worse in that heat. By this point, they're already running low on water, not just a bit low, but critical.
I'll be honest, seeing how little water they had here changes how I read everything that follows.
The ground is also just soaking up heat and throwing it back up, making everything feel even worse. This is where Melanie decides to keep going instead of turning back to the road, thinking they're close enough to finish. But that choice keeps them out longer, more climbing, more exposure, less water, and heat stress that keeps building without easing. Phil began to show clear signs of heat exhaustion, including headache, nausea, and diminished sweating. Melanie attempted to manage their remaining water, but physiological decline was already underway. Within a short period, Phil's condition progressed to heat stroke, marked by confusion and loss of coherent speech. Melanie attempted to reverse course toward the road, but the terrain no longer matched her reference points. Every route ended in dead ends or impassable gullies. As her condition worsened, she also developed symptoms of severe heat illness, including dizziness, confusion, and impaired judgment, further reducing her ability to navigate. As temperatures peaked, Phil collapsed first and became unresponsive. Melanie attempted to move him into the limited shade of a gully wall, but conditions were no longer survivable in place. His condition deteriorated rapidly, and he died later that evening from hyperthermia and organ failure following prolonged exposure to extreme heat. Milani remained with him for a period of time before attempting to retrace their route toward the road for help. However, by this point, she was also experiencing advanced heat stroke symptoms, including confusion, impaired judgment, and severe dehydration. Her movement became increasingly erratic, and she lost reliable orientation within the branching drainage system.
This is one of those points where even a familiar route doesn't really exist the same way anymore. It just turns into disconnected pieces that don't line up.
She was later found in a separate section of the Badlands after collapsing during attempted self-evacuation. She died from severe hyperthermia and dehydration after prolonged exposure and heat stroke, with investigators noting that cognitive decline likely occurred while she was still attempting to navigate out rather than after sustained independent travel. Rescue teams arrived the following morning. Phil was recovered from the original shelter site, while Milani was found further along the drainage system. Both fatalities were attributed to extreme heat exposure, insufficient water supply, and delayed evacuation from hazardous terrain. An official review concluded that the incident resulted from a combination of factors, including insufficient water supply, off-trail travel in hazardous terrain, reliance on non-verified digital navigation, and delayed response to escalating heat illness. The case was later used in safety briefings highlighting how rapidly desert environments can become life-threatening when exposure, dehydration, and disorientation occur simultaneously. It was June 22, 2016. The South Kaibab Trail carved along an exposed ridgeline from the south rim all the way down to the Colorado River. 7 miles of open sun with no water and no shade at any point. By 8 in the morning, the rim was already at 84 degrees Fahrenheit. The inner canyon was forecast to hit 111 by early afternoon. Trinity Bivens was 38 years old and worked in marketing in Los Angeles. She was in the middle of a solo Southwest road trip, hitting national parks back-to-back, posting as she went. The Grand Canyon was a scheduled stop, one day, maybe two. She had no prior canyon hiking experience, but she was fit, she was confident, and she had done enough urban hiking around Griffith Park to feel like she understood trails. The night before she hiked, she bought a small designer day pack from a gift shop near her hotel, packed it with her phone, sunglasses, a thin cardigan, and a single 20-ounce water bottle, and set an early alarm. She showed up at the trailhead the next morning like she was heading to a workout class. At the trailhead, a large sign warned hikers not to continue without enough water and to turn around if unprepared. Trinity glanced at it briefly, then stepped to the side to take a photo of the canyon and continued down the trail. About a mile in, a woman who had already come back up stopped and told Trinity it was getting too hot to continue. Trinity was busy lining up a photo on her phone. She gave a quick acknowledgement, waited for the woman to move out of the frame, and went back to taking pictures. Then she kept walking.
Looking back, it feels like Trinity spent far more time thinking about the canyon as a backdrop than as an environment that she actually had to deal with.
At Cedar Ridge, a volunteer trail worker noticed that her only water bottle was already more than half empty. He told her directly that continuing without more water in those conditions was dangerous. Trinity barely looked up from her phone, said she just wanted to get a few better shots, and asked which overlook had the best view. When he advised her to turn around, she continued down the trail anyway. He logged the interaction, including the time, her water supply, and her refusal to follow the warning. By the time Trinity reached Skeleton Point around 10:40 that morning, her water bottle was empty. She had spent more than 2 hours in direct sun and still had 3,000 feet of climbing ahead of her. A pair of hikers noticed she looked flushed and asked if she was heading back. She said yes and kept moving. Somewhere near Skeleton Point, she finally turned around and started the climb out. The climb back to the rim from that point is 3 miles of continuous ascent along a fully exposed ridgeline that gains roughly 3,000 feet. There is no shade, no water, and very little relief anywhere on the route. Descending it in the cooler hours of the morning is challenging enough. Climbing it back toward the rim near midday, dehydrated and already overheated, is a completely different experience. Within the first half mile of the ascent, Trinity's pace had slowed to a near crawl. The trail surface sat in direct sunlight and radiated heat upward, meaning her body was absorbing it from above and below at the same time. She had already spent more than 2 hours in extreme heat without replacing the water she had lost, and the physical effort of the climb pushed her body beyond what it could handle. About 45 minutes into the ascent, a group of 3 hikers rounded a bend and and found her sitting on the trail with her knees drawn up and her head lowered. She did not respond when they called out to her. When one of them touched her arm, her skin felt hot and completely dry. Her breathing was fast, shallow, and loud enough to be heard from several feet away.
By this point, nothing about what was happening felt surprising anymore. Every warning had been ignored, and the canyon was simply following through.
One hiker poured water over her neck and wrists. Another tried to get a verbal response. She opened her eyes briefly but could not speak. The third went through her bag. Phone, sunglasses, cardigan, lip balm. No food, no electrolytes, nothing useful. The empty 20-ounce bottle was at the bottom of the pack. One of them had cell signal at that elevation and called emergency services at 11:32 in the morning. A helicopter reached the area at around 12:10 in the afternoon. The exposed ridgeline allowed a direct approach. She was airlifted from the trail, and resuscitation was performed during transport. She was pronounced dead at a medical facility at 12:51 in the afternoon. The coroner listed cause of death as heat stroke with cardiovascular collapse. Her core temperature at airlift was 108 degrees Fahrenheit. No water remained in her pack. The trail workers' log provided a precise timestamp and a record of their exchange at Cedar Ridge. The descending hikers gave formal statements. The case was ruled accidental, with contributing factors including inadequate water, continuation past multiple advised turnaround points, and ascent during peak heat on a fully exposed trail with no shade or water at any point. The Grand Canyon has a way of meeting people exactly where their confidence ends. On the Hermit Trail the following summer, a woman with 2 previous canyon hikes decided that was enough to go deeper into one of the most remote corridors in the park alone. It was July 16th, 2022, and the mid-morning sun was already climbing over the south rim of the Grand Canyon. Though the dry desert air up on the rim still felt deceptively easy, the kind of comfortable that fools you into thinking the whole day will feel that way, where a young woman in cute low-top sneakers stood at the lip of a trailhead filming a quick intro clip on her phone before she started down. Aubrey Lindquist was 24 and lived in a suburb outside Minneapolis, where the land is flat and green and humid and sits down near sea level, which matters more than it sounds like it should. Her body had spent its whole life in thick, wet, low air, the kind where you sweat and the sweat sits on your skin, and it had never once had to deal with the kind of bone-dry desert heat she was about to walk into. That matters a lot, because in dry heat, your sweat evaporates so fast you don't even feel wet, so you don't realize how much water you're pouring out of your body every minute. You can be dangerously dehydrated and feel relatively dry and fine, right up until you very suddenly aren't. The thing about being good at making hard things look easy is that after a while, you can start to believe your own footage. That skill is part of what got her down that trail, and it's part of what kept her going past the point where she should have turned around. People who knew her said she was the friend who was always up for a spontaneous trip, the one who'd book a flight on a whim and figure out the details later, which is a wonderful way to live right up until the details are the only thing keeping you alive.
I've watched the content of people exactly like her before, and it's easy to forget how effortless and easy they make it look on video, and it's mostly just good editing on their part.
The whole trip started with one video. A creator Aubrey followed had posted a glossy little clip of herself strolling from the rim all the way down to the Colorado River and back, set to a trending sound, captioned like it was a fun half-day adventure anybody could knock out before lunch. The same creator had a second clip that did even bigger numbers, a hidden off-trail overlook she called her secret spot, this jaw-dropping view tucked away from the main path that racked up millions of views.
There was no mention of heat anywhere in either video. No mention of how much water you actually need, which on a hike like that in the heat is several liters at least, not one cute little bottle.
No mention of when you're supposed to turn around, no mention of the temperature difference between the rim and the bottom, nothing about the fact that the rangers and everyone who works that canyon practically beg visitors not to try to hike to the river and back in a single day. None of the stuff that actually matters, because none of the stuff that actually matters makes for a fun 15-second clip. What you got instead was a pretty girl, a gorgeous view, a trending song, and a vibe that said this is easy, this is doable, this is your sign to book the trip. Aubrey watched it enough times that she basically had the route memorized in her head, or at least she thought she did, which turned out to be a very different thing from actually knowing it. She saved the clip to a little trip folder on her phone and rewatched it on the drive in. She texted a friend that she was just going to do the easy famous one everybody does and grab the secret spot photo while she was at it. And that was the plan in her head. A cute hike, a couple of incredible photos, back to the car by early afternoon. The canyon had a very different plan, and the enormous gap between those two things, between the cute hike she pictured and the furnace she actually walked into is the entire story. She wasn't trying to do anything extreme. She wasn't trying to break a record or push any limits. She thought she was doing the safe, normal, popular thing, the one everybody does, and that belief is exactly what made her let her guard all the way down.
I want to be fair to her here. She wasn't reckless per se, she was just trusting the only version of that canyon she'd ever been shown.
A clip like that strips out every single boring detail that would actually keep you alive. The water math, the timing, the heat, because none of that is fun to watch, and what's left is a 15-second daydream that millions of people quietly file away as something they could totally do too. She packed to match the creator almost exactly. One small sling bag, one 24-ounce water bottle, her phone, a portable charger, sunglasses, and the cute low-top sneakers she always wore in her videos because they looked good on camera. No hat, no real food beyond a granola bar or two, no electrolytes, no extra layers, no map beyond the trail she'd seen on her screen. For a flat paved walk around a lake back home, that kit is totally fine. For one of the most punishing day hikes in the entire country, in the middle of July, it's almost nothing.
The park doesn't hand you one simple number. It tells you to carry several liters at a minimum, to drink steadily instead of waiting until you're thirsty, to eat salty snacks so that your body can hold onto that water, to wear a wide hat and real shoes with grip, and honestly, not to try to hike all the way to the river and back in a single summer day at all.
She had a fraction of one of those things, but it matched the video, and in her mind, the video was the instruction manual, so she felt prepared. That's maybe the scariest part of the whole setup, that she genuinely thought she was ready, because the only source she'd checked had told her there was nothing to get ready for.
That single bottle says everything to me. That little bottle, it's the whole gap between the trip that she pictured and the one that she actually got and prepared for.
She also started late. Everyone who knows that canyon will tell you the only safe way to do a big descent in summer is to be moving in the dark before sunrise, and to be back up top before the worst of the afternoon. But the video had been filmed in soft, pretty light, and Aubrey wanted that same look for her secret spot shot, so she didn't even reach the trailhead until mid-morning. By the time she was lacing up her sneakers at the rim, the sun was already well up and climbing, and all that bare rock was starting to soak in the heat that it would radiate right back at her for the rest of the day, like the inside of an oven. The cool morning window, the only forgiving part of a summer day down there, was already closing behind her before she took her first step. She didn't know that's what was happening. To her, it just felt like a nice, warm, sunny morning, perfect light for filming, the day getting started a little later than planned, but no big deal. At the trailhead, there were signs. There are always signs, and they are not subtle. Stacked warnings about how hiking to the river and back in one day is strongly discouraged, about how the heat down in the canyon kills people, real blunt language with little graphics of a hiker in distress, the kind of signage that exists specifically because so many people have died doing exactly what she was about to do.
Aubrey did glance at them.
There was even one specifically aimed at young, fit-looking hikers, basically saying that being young and in shape does not protect you down here, that the people this canyon takes are very often exactly the confident ones who feel great on the way down.
She skimmed them the way a lot of people do and decided they were meant for tourists who didn't really know what they were getting into, not for someone young and fit and capable like her, so she filed them away and kept moving.
The video had already told her this was a fun, easy thing, and a wall of scary words and distressed hiker graphics just did not match the bright little daydream she'd packed for.
Those signs were basically a description of her exact plan, and it stuns me that she read straight past every single line.
The trouble is that a warning sign and a 15-second video are not a fair fight. The sign is static and grim and easy to read as something meant for other people, the unfit, the unprepared, the ones who supposedly do not know what they are doing, and Aubrey did not see herself as any of those. The video was bright and moving and full of a real person who looked just like her, doing the exact thing and loving every second of it, and it had been playing in her head for weeks. One of those things had her full attention and the easy trust she handed to the people she followed online, and the other was just a sign by a trail she was already walking past. By the time those warnings might have mattered, the video had already won, the way it almost always does. The way down felt amazing, and that's the cruel trick of this place. Going down is easy. It's all downhill. The morning air higher up still had a little coolness to it, and every switchback opened up another view that looked exactly like the ones that had pulled her here in the first place. She filmed as she went, narrating little clips, feeling strong and light and completely vindicated, like all the worry online was overblown and she'd been right to just go for it. Her legs felt great. Her one little bottle was already running low, but she wasn't worried about it in the slightest because she still felt strong and the video had made the whole thing look so casual that running out just didn't seem like a real possibility. She passed a few other hikers heading up who looked absolutely wrecked, red-faced and soaked through and moving in that slow, grinding shuffle of people who are running on empty, and she didn't really clock what that meant. To her, they were just out-of-shape people having a rough day. She didn't understand that she was looking at her own near future, that those people were paying the exact bill she hadn't even started running up yet. She gave a couple of them a cheerful little hello and kept bounding down, feeling like proof that the whole thing was easier than people made it out to be.
I know that floaty downhill feeling so well. The one whispering, "This is easy," and out here, it's the most expensive lie there is.
What your body doesn't tell you on the way down is that every single one of those easy downhill steps is a step you are going to have to climb back up later, in far worse heat with far less in the tank. The canyon flips the normal rule of hiking completely upside down. On a normal hike, you climb up first while you're fresh and strong, then you get the easy downhill on the way home when you're tired. Here, it's backwards. The easy part comes first and lies right to your face, and the hard part, the long climb, waits for you at the very bottom at the very hottest part of the day, exactly when you have the least left to give. Aubrey went down feeling unstoppable, and because she felt that good, she went down a lot further than she'd ever planned to, chasing views and that easy floaty feeling, never once stopping to picture herself doing every one of those steps in reverse, uphill, in the heat, on an empty bottle. When you feel that strong, it is almost impossible to imagine feeling any other way, and the canyon knows that about people, and it waits. And the deeper she went, the more the canyon rewarded her for it. The light kept shifting on the rock walls. The views kept opening up into something even bigger than the last one, and every few minutes there was another frame worth stopping for. She was narrating little clips to her phone, telling whoever would watch later how unreal it all was, how she could not believe more people did not just do this. Her body felt loose and strong and capable in a way that made the whole idea of danger feel like something that happened to other, less careful people. That feeling, the easy strength of going downhill in the early part of the day, is the single most expensive feeling in that entire canyon, because it is borrowed against a climb she had not begun to think about yet.
It messes with me that the easy part comes first, because by the time the canyon shows its teeth, you've already spent everything.
By the time she got all the way down into the lower canyon and out toward the river, the temperature had climbed in a way that didn't feel real to someone from a place where a hot day means the mid-80s. Down low, boxed in by all that dark rock, soaking up the sun and throwing the heat right back at her from every direction, it can easily run 20 degrees hotter than it is up on the rim. So even on a day that felt hot but totally manageable up on top, down at the bottom, it was a different world entirely. While the people up on the rim were having a warm but survivable afternoon, Aubrey had basically descended into a furnace, step by step, feeling fine the whole way down because going down is easy, and the worst of the heat builds slowly enough that you don't notice it cooking you until you try to do something hard. She got down to the water, got her photos, dipped her feet in, and sat in one of the rare patches of real shade to rest, and that's where she felt the first little flickers of something being off. A headache starting up behind her eyes. A heart rate that wouldn't fully settle even though she was sitting completely still. A kind of tiredness that felt heavier than it should have for someone who'd only gone downhill so far. She didn't think much of it, she just figured she was hot and needed a rest, which is exactly what nearly everyone thinks right before things go bad out there. She drank the rest of her water down at the river because she was thirsty and it was right there and her brain wasn't doing the math on what came next. The bottle that was supposed to get her all the way back up to the rim was now basically empty. What she had no clue about, because the video had never once shown it, was that down near the river along the main corridor, there was actually drinkable water and a ranger station, real help that might have changed everything. And the off-trail detour she was about to take would pull her away from all of it before she ever stumbled onto it.
Her drinking the last of her water at the lowest, hottest point of the route is the part that I had to read twice.
There's a rule serious hikers live by out there, that you turn around once you've used up about a third of your water and your energy, because you have to save the bigger share for the climb out. Aubrey had never heard that rule in her life. The video never said it, none of the captions mentioned it, nobody had pulled her aside and told her, and so she sailed right past the most important moment of her entire day without ever knowing the moment was even there. She had already used up way more than a third of everything. Her water was gone, her energy was fading, and by the real rules of that canyon, she was already in trouble. She just felt fine enough to not realize it yet.
It haunts me a bit that the single most important call of her day was one that nobody ever told her that she was supposed to make.
And then, instead of starting the long climb back out while she still had even a little bit left in her, she decided she still had time for the secret spot. That photo was half the reason she'd driven all this way. The shot that had pulled millions of views for the creator she followed, the one that would have been the centerpiece of her whole trip. And she was so close, or at least she thought she was. She pulled up the saved clip one more time, studied the rock formations in the background, tried to match them up to the shapes around her, and made the call that quietly turned a dangerous situation into a fatal one. She stepped off the maintained trail to go find a spot she'd only ever seen on a screen.
If there's 1 second of this whole story I'd reach back through time to stop, it's the step that she took off that trail.
Leaving that trail was the point of no return, even though it absolutely did not feel like it at the time. This was not some marathon wandering search. She had a rough idea of where the spot should be and set off straight toward it, but off the maintained path, the canyon turns into a different kind of trap. There was no shade out there at all. No other people, no trail markers, nothing but rock and sun and silence. And this is the moment the heat she had been shrugging off all the way down finally forced itself on her. Her head was pounding now. Her shirt was soaked through. Her heart would not slow down. And every short scramble over the broken ground took more out of her than it had any right to, because she was doing it on a body with no water left in it. Even people with maps and proper training and plenty of water have lost their bearings out here, where every ridge and dry wash looks exactly like the one beside it. So a first-timer from Minnesota working off the memory of a video had very little margin for even the few minutes she spent picking her way across it. And the spot, the whole reason she had left the safety of the trail, did not look anything like it had on her screen, because a place filmed in soft light at the right angle almost never does once you are standing in it, overheating and squinting and starting to feel genuinely unwell. It did not take her long to give it up, but the short detour had done its quiet damage all the same. It had pulled her off the corridor and away from the water and the ranger stations she never knew were there, and it had taken a real bite out of the little time and energy she had left. By the time the photo stopped mattering to her, the canyon had quietly collected most of what she had, and she had not even started the part that actually kills people.
I picture her out there alone, turning in circles with a dead phone and a saved video that suddenly couldn't help her at all.
By the time she turned back toward the main trail, she was nearly out of everything, shaky and overheating, and the hottest part of the afternoon was only just getting started. I hate that she gave up the photo a beat too late, after the canyon had already taken what she needed to climb out. The climb is where the canyon collects what it's owed. By now, it was well into the afternoon, and the heat deep in the canyon was somewhere north of 110 degrees, the kind of heat that is genuinely an emergency for a body that grew up in cool, wet Minnesota air. Aubrey started up with almost nothing left in the tank. No water, no food that mattered, no shade anywhere, and a long, brutal vertical climb of thousands of feet between her and the rim. The same descent that had felt so easy and fun in the morning was now a wall she had to climb in the worst heat of the day. At first, it was just misery. A pounding heart, a churning stomach, legs that felt like they were slowly filling up with wet sand. She kept stopping every few steps, kept telling herself she just needed a second to catch her breath, kept badly underestimating how much trouble she was actually in, because she had spent the entire day being told by a video that this was easy, and her brain kept defaulting back to that. Every time she sat down to rest, she was actually losing ground, because resting in that heat with no water doesn't recharge you. Your core just keeps climbing. The further she climbed, the more her body started sending up signals she had never felt before and did not know how to read. A deep, sloshing nausea, a headache that went from a dull ache to something that pulsed behind her eyes with every heartbeat, cramps knotting up in her calves and her hands. And underneath all of it, for the first time all day, real fear. The slow, creeping understanding that something was genuinely wrong and that she was a very long way from any kind of help. She kept reaching for the bottle out of pure reflex, tilting it back and getting nothing but a warm plastic taste and a few useless drops. She told herself she just had to keep moving, one switchback at a time, but each one was taking longer than the last, and the rim above her never seemed to get any closer at all.
It floors me that effort meant nothing here. You can't push through a body that has run out of the water that it needs to survive and to cool down.
By now, the trail around her had emptied out, because anyone with any sense was either long since back up top or had never dropped down into that furnace in the first place. There was no steady stream of hikers to wave down, no ranger appearing around the next bend, just the odd distant figure far above or below her, much too far away to matter. It was the hottest stretch of the day in the hottest part of the canyon, and she was almost entirely alone in it, with thousands of vertical feet still standing between her and the rim, and a body that had already burned through everything it needed to get up there. Then the scarier stuff started. The stuff that means a body is genuinely overheating from the inside out. The thing most people don't realize about heat at that level is that at a certain point your body actually stops sweating. It just runs out of the water it needs to make sweat, and once you stop sweating, you lose the only real way you have to cool yourself down, and the core temperature starts climbing fast and doesn't stop. That's the line between being miserably hot and being in genuine mortal danger, and Aubrey crossed it somewhere on that climb without ever knowing she had.
There's a cruel mercy in it, in a way, because by the time the heat is doing that to you, it's also taking away your ability to understand that it's even happening.
The part of your brain that should be screaming at you to get help is the part going offline first. She got confused. She started stumbling, taking wrong steps, struggling to track where the trail even was in front of her. The clear thinking that might have told her to flag down help or stay put in one spot was the exact thing the heat was taking from her first. Somewhere in there, she wandered off the route again, this time not chasing a photo, but just desperately looking for shade, looking for relief, looking for anything, and she ended up tucked into a thin sliver of shadow against the rock, off in an area where the few other hikers still out in that heat wouldn't be passing by. Her phone had no signal, the way it hadn't all day. There was no one within earshot to call out to, and the canyon just went quiet and hot and still around her, the way it has around far too many people who walked in trusting that it would be easy.
And it kind of guts me that by the time she stopped, the part of her that should scream for help was the first thing that the heat took.
She didn't come back that evening. Her friend's texts went unanswered. Easy to wave off at first because there is no signal down in the canyon, but when her rental car was found, still sitting in the trailhead lot long after any day hike should have ended, the unease turned into something real. The search began the next morning, and it did not take the team long to recognize a pattern they had walked through too many times. The late start, the river photos, the single empty bottle, the drift off the corridor. They found her in the rough, broken ground where people in deep heat trouble tend to wander looking for shade that isn't there, and by then, there was no rescue left to make. The medical examiner ruled it environmental, heat-related hyperthermia with dehydration a contributing factor, the same ruling written out at that canyon far more often than anyone watching would ever guess. No foul play, nothing criminal, just a young woman whose body could not survive what she had walked into.
I can't make peace that the clip that sent her there is probably still online, captioned like it's nothing at all.
All of it was preventable, and that is the hardest part to sit with. There was a sign at the top that spelled out almost exactly what was going to happen. There was a turnaround rule that would have saved her if she had ever once heard it. There was a version of that day where she carries enough water, skips the secret spot, turns back in time, and walks out tired and sunburned and completely fine with a phone full of nice photos and a good story. That version was available to her the entire time, and a 15-second video, made by someone who almost certainly meant no harm, had quietly talked her out of every exit ramp, one easy-looking frame at a time. The trip looked easy because somebody made it look easy on purpose. And out there, in that heat, on that climb, looking easy and being easy are two completely different things.